The letter had already been sent by the time anyone ought to feel ashamed about it. Barton Crowell stood at the far end of the platform with his thumbs hooked in his vest pockets, and he was smiling the way a man smiles when he's certain the joke is going to land exactly the way he planned it. Written the advertisement himself, rancher seeks capable woman. Companionship and partnership. Raven Creek, Montana, and he'd signed Colton Hayes' name to it without asking, without warning, without a single moment of hesitation. The other men thought it was funny. Even the telegraph operator had laughed. Mail-order bride for Colton Hayes, the most closed-off, hard-edged, solitary man in 3 counties. Man who hadn't said more than 12 words to any of them in the past 2 years. Crowell figured she'd take one look at the situation and turn right back around. She didn't. Well, that would be funnier still. What he did not plan for was the child. What none of them planned for was Clara. If you've ever been laughed at for simply showing up, if you've ever stood somewhere and felt the ground beneath you wasn't meant to hold your weight, then stay with this story. Because what happened on that platform in Raven Creek in the autumn of 1888 is going to matter to you. And if you're watching this and you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, please do it now. Hit that like button. Drop a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Because I promise you, you do not want to miss what comes next. Train from Billings arrived 40 minutes late, which gave the men gathered near the grain store plenty of time to work themselves into a good mood about the whole thing. 6 of them Crowell's usual orbit, the kind of men who laughed at other people's misfortune and called it entertainment. They had a clear view of the platform from where they stood, and they passed a flask between them and waited. Colton Hayes did not know he was waiting for anyone. Come into town for feed and nails, same as he did every second Thursday. Had his wagon, his 2 mules, and a list his hired hand had written on the back of an old receipt. He was not thinking about women. He was not thinking about marriage. Looked him. He was thinking about whether the hardware store had finally gotten in the new gauge wire he'd been asking about for 3 weeks, and whether the storm moving in from the north would hit before he made it back to the ranch. See, he was standing at the back of his wagon, checking the wheel brake, when he heard the train whistle, and he didn't look up. It was Hank Deaver who first saw Clara step off the car. Hank was 23 and not particularly bright, but he had good eyes, and what he saw made him elbow the man beside him hard enough to spill the flask. "There she is," he said, and his voice had that particular quality of someone trying not to laugh too soon and ruin the moment. Clara Whitmore came off the train, the way a person comes off a long journey carefully, like her legs weren't entirely sure of the ground yet. She was 28 years old, and she looked it not worn out, not soft either, somewhere in between. She had dark hair pinned up under a hat that had seen better days, a travel coat with a mended tear at the left shoulder, and a carpetbag in her right hand. In her left hand, she held the hand of a small boy who could not have been more than 4 years old, and the boy was looking at everything the platform, the horses, the mountains in the distance with the wide-eyed attention of someone for whom the world was still genuinely astonishing. She stopped at the edge of the platform and looked around. Clear she was looking for someone. She had a piece of paper in her coat pocket. She'd read it so many times the fold lines were starting to split, and she knew the name on it. Colton Hayes. She'd been told he would be there to meet her. She did not see anyone who looked like they were waiting for her. What she did see, though she didn't fully understand it yet, were the men by the grain store who had stopped their conversation and were watching her with expressions she couldn't quite read from that distance. Eli tugged at her hand. "Mom, are we staying?" "Yes," she said, because she had decided that on the train somewhere between Miles City and Raven Creek. Whatever happened, she was not getting back on that train. She had $11 left in the world, a son who needed stability more than he needed anything else, and an arrangement on paper that was the closest thing to a plan she had. Staying. She stepped off the platform and into the dirt of the main street, and that was when Hank Deaver started laughing. It wasn't a quiet laugh. It carried, and the others caught it quickly the way laughter does in a group of men who've been primed for something. Clara turned toward the sound, and the men didn't bother to hide it. They just stood there, looking at her and the boy, grinning like they were watching a performance. She didn't look away from them. That was the first thing. She looked right at them and didn't flinch, and that surprised them, though not enough to make them stop. One of them she'd learn later. His name was Pete Garlow, called out, "You here for Colton Hayes, sweetheart?" She said yes, clearly, without hesitation. That made them laugh harder. She stood in the dirt with Eli's hand in hers, and she waited. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes were steady. Inside her chest was a very different story, but she'd had enough practice at keeping that separate from her face that no one could have read it. Colton Hayes heard his name from 20 yards away and turned around. He saw the men laughing first. Then he followed their line of sight and saw the woman and the boy standing in the street, and his first thought was that he didn't know who she was. Second thought, coming hard on the heels of the first, was that something had just happened that he was going to need someone to explain to him. Walked over. Not fast, not slow. He walked the way he did most things without wasted motion. Stopped in front of Clara at a reasonable distance. Looked at her. Then looked at the boy. Then looked back at her. "You're looking for me? If you're Colton Hayes." She met his eyes without dropping them. "I'm Clara Whitmore. I have a letter from the agency." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "What agency?" And that was when it began to come together for Clara, though it would take another hour before she understood the full shape of it. She pulled the letter from her pocket, worn soft at the creases, and held it out. He took it and read it. She watched his face as he read, and she saw the moment he understood what was in his hands, because something shifted in his expression. Not anger exactly. Something colder than anger, turned inward. He looked over at the men by the grain store. Crowell had joined them now, and he was smiling with a particular kind of satisfaction that a certain type of man gets from watching his plan work. "Hayes," Crowell called out, and his voice carried the warmth of a man who thought he was in complete control of a situation. "Looks like you've got company." He spread his hands like he was presenting something. "We thought you needed a little help with that loneliness problem." Men laughed. Someone whistled low. Colton read the letter one more time. Then he folded it carefully and held it back out to Clara. Took it, watching him, waiting for whatever came next. The boy pressed closer to her side, but didn't hide behind her. He just stood there, watching Colton with the unself-conscious directness that children have before they learn to be careful. Colton looked down at the boy for a moment. Then he looked at Clara. "How long have you been traveling?" he asked. The question was so unexpected, so removed from what she had steeled herself to hear, that it took her half a second to answer. 4 days, he nodded once. Looked back at the men across the street. And there was something in his face then that Clara would think about later, not rage, not humiliation. Just a clear and quiet decision being made. "She came all this way," he said. And though he wasn't shouting, his voice carried the way voices do when there's a certain weight behind them. "She deserves a home." He picked up her carpet bag before she could stop him, and he walked back toward his wagon. Clara stood in the street for a moment, not moving. She wasn't sure if she'd heard him correctly. The laughter behind her had gone quiet. Eli looked up at her. "Mama? Come on," she said, and followed Colton Hayes to his wagon. Ride to the ranch was mostly quiet, which suited both of them. Eli fell asleep against Clara's side within the first 20 minutes, his head heavy on her arm, and she let him. He'd been holding himself together for 4 days with the particular resilience of small children who don't fully understand what's happening but can feel their mother's tension and respond to it. Now that they were moving and the immediate uncertainty had passed, his body gave out. Clara did not sleep. She watched the landscape, the dry grass, the ridgeline, the sky going a dark bruised purple at the edges where the storm was coming in, and she thought about what she was doing. This was not the first time she'd made a decision that looked, from the outside, like pure recklessness. First time had been leaving Dobson, the man she'd married at 19, the man who was charming until he wasn't, and then was never charming again. Decision had cost her everything she'd been told she needed. A house, respectability, a husband's name. What it had given her was Eli, and the knowledge that she was capable of surviving things she'd previously thought would break her. This was different. This was a stranger's wagon, and a stranger's ranch, and a situation that had been designed by people she'd never met to humiliate her. "Didn't know," she said. She wasn't asking. She'd watched his face when he read the letter. Colton kept his eyes on the road. "No. How long have you known Crowell?" It was quiet for a moment. Long enough. She wanted to ask more questions, but she could feel the wall there not hostile exactly, just solid, and she filed the questions away for later. There would be time. If she played this right, there would be time. "I'm not asking you to honor the arrangement," she said. "I know it wasn't made honestly. I just need," she paused, organizing it. "I need 2 weeks. To find my footing. I have some money. Not much, but I can pay for the room." Didn't answer right away. The wagon moved through a dry creek crossing, the wheels jolting, and Eli stirred but didn't wake. "Keep your money," Colton said finally. 2 weeks is fine." She looked at him. He was watching the road, his profile sharp against the last light. He had the kind of face that had been weathered hard by work and weather, and whatever else life had put him through, not old, maybe mid-30s, but settled in his bones the way people who've carried a lot get settled. "Thank you," she said. Didn't say anything to that. She noticed he shifted the reins to one hand so he could pull his coat a little tighter against the wind coming off the mountain. She thought that whatever else Colton Hayes was not cruel. That was not nothing. After the year she'd had, that was not nothing at all. Ranch was not what she'd expected, which she told herself later was her own fault for having expectations at all. She had imagined, despite her best efforts, not to something modest but functional. Clean house, a working well, a kitchen that smelled like it had been used recently. What she found was a house that had clearly been built by someone who understood structure and then left largely alone by a man who understood cattle and very little else. Main room had a good stone fireplace and a solid table, and 2 chairs, one of which had a cracked leg repaired with wire. There was a kitchen area with a cast iron stove and pots hanging from hooks, but the stove needed cleaning and there were mouse droppings in the corner near the flour bin. There was 1 bedroom, and a sleeping area that had been a pantry, and a loft above the main room that you reached by a ladder nailed to the wall. Colton showed her the space without apology or explanation, and she appreciated that. She'd had enough men in her life who talked around the thing instead of just showing it to her and letting her decide. "Loft's dry," he said. "Warmer than the pantry." She looked up at it, then at Eli, who had woken up and was standing in the middle of the room, turning slowly in a circle with his arms out like he was measuring the space by wingspan. "Loft is fine," she said. Got Eli settled, she'd brought a bedroll, which she'd laid out in the loft. She'd packed a small toy for him, a wooden horse that had belonged to her own father once, and then she came back downstairs and stood in the kitchen and looked at what she had to work with. Eggs. There were potatoes. There was salt pork that had not quite gone off yet, and dried beans and a small sack of cornmeal. It was the better part of a wheel of hard cheese. She found a cast iron skillet that was still well seasoned despite everything else, which she took as a good sign about something, though she wasn't sure what. Cooked. It was something she could do when everything else was uncertain. She could make a meal out of what was there and make it good, and that was a kind of control she'd relied on before when nothing else was in her hands. Colton came in from the barn while she was cooking and stopped just inside the door. He looked at the stove. He looked at her. "You don't have to do that," he said. "I know," she said. "I wanted to." He washed his hands at the basin and sat down at the table and waited. And she noticed he didn't try to tell her how he liked things or what she should have made differently, which was again more than she was bracing herself for. Eli came down from the loft when he smelled the food and climbed onto the second chair and looked across the table at Colton with the evaluating stare that 4-year-olds direct at people they aren't sure about yet. "Are you the cowboy?" Eli asked. Colton looked at the boy. "Beat. I work with cattle, so." Eli seemed to find this a satisfying answer. "My mama can cook really good," he offered. "I can see that," Colton said, and Clara set the skillet down and pretended she hadn't heard it. First night she didn't sleep. She lay in the loft with Eli, breathing slow beside her, and she stared at the rafters, and she thought about the men on that platform, and the quality of their laughter, the kind that assumes the person being laughed at has no recourse, no power, no capacity to alter the story they're being placed inside. She had been underestimated like that before, and she understood that it was both a danger and a resource. Danger because underestimation sometimes became a self-fulfilling condition. You could get so worn down by it that you stopped contesting it. Resource because people who underestimate you stop watching carefully, and when they stop watching carefully, you have room to move. She had come here with $11 and a letter and a 4-year-old and no other options. She had no intention of being what Barton Crowell expected her to be. What she needed was time and information, and a clearer understanding of what exactly she'd walked into. She started with what she knew. The ranch had land, she'd seen it in the last light coming in, more than she'd expected, rolling out in 2 directions from the buildings. It had a functional barn and at least 6 head of cattle that she'd counted, probably more that she hadn't seen. It had a man who was clearly capable of working hard, but equally clearly had been operating alone, for long enough that the house had gone soft around the edges while the barn remained tight. 3. And it had a problem she couldn't fully name yet, but could feel something about the way Colton's jaw had gone when he read that letter, something about the specific quality of Crowell's satisfaction on that platform. She'd been around enough difficult situations to know when a fight was already in progress, and she'd just walked into the middle of it without knowing the shape of it yet. She would learn the shape of it. That was what she did. First week was a negotiation without anyone saying so. Colton was not an easy man to read, and he wasn't trying to be. He was up before dawn every morning. She could hear him moving below before she'd even fully surfaced from sleep, and he was in the barn or out on the land until the light failed. He ate what she cooked without comment and did not appear to expect conversation, which was both a relief and, in its own way, kind of loneliness she recognized from the outside. She cleaned the kitchen first. She fixed the crack in the chair leg with proper wood glue she found in the barn, not wire. She got the stove hot enough to burn off the residue and seasoned the iron again. She set Eli to small tasks gathering kindling, keeping track of the water level in the indoor pail, because a 4-year-old with nothing to do was a disaster waiting to happen. And because she believed, hard and fast, that a child who learned to work, learned to feel capable, and she was going to give her son every tool she could think of. The third day she walked the land. She took Eli with her, and she walked south first, along the fence line, then west toward the tree line. She was looking at the soil, the slope of the drainage, the quality of the grass. She'd grown up on a farm, not a great one, but a working one, and she had a farmer's eye even if she hadn't used it in years. What she found in the southwest corner changed her thinking considerably. It was a field maybe 15 acres, probably more that had been let go. She'd see the old furrow lines under the weed growth, and the soil when she dug down a few inches with the heel of her boot was dark and dense. Good soil, farmland that had been farmed once and then abandoned. She stood there in the overgrown field with the mountains at her back, and Eli crouched beside her poking at a beetle in the dirt, and she thought about what she'd read in the letter about Colton's operation. Cattle. Just cattle. No diversification, no crop. On a piece of land that clearly had the capacity for both. She went back to the house and started asking questions. She asked them at dinner, which was the only time she reliably had Colton in the same room. She'd learned by then that he wasn't resistant to conversation. Exactly, he just didn't see any reason to pursue it for its own sake. If she said something worth responding to, he responded. She asked something worth answering, he answered. Southwest Field, she said. Was it farmed before? Looked up from his plate. My father's time, why did it stop? Pause. It stopped when he died and there was nobody to keep it going. She waited to see if there was more, but there wasn't. How long ago was that? 8 years. She nodded. Speared a piece of potato and chewed it. Eli was ignoring the conversation completely, wholly focused on a small drama he was conducting between a piece of cornbread and his spoon. I think that field could produce again, she said. Not immediately, but with work by spring. Colton looked at her steadily. What would you plant? Corn, primarily. Maybe for the north section where the drainage is poorer. She looked at him across the table. I'm not a rancher, but I know farming. He was quiet for a moment. Couldn't tell if he was dismissing the idea or considering it. Face didn't give much. The ground's been fallow 8 years, he said finally. That's not necessarily bad. I know, she said. That's why I brought it up. He looked at her a moment longer, then went back to eating. He counted that as a draw, which was more than she'd expected. Trouble started on the 9th day. She was in town for supplies. She'd taken the smaller of the 2 mules, and a list she and Colton had gone over together that morning, with a kind of careful practicality that was becoming their primary mode of communication when she ran into Mabel Forsythe at the dry goods store. Mabel was 50-something, the wife of the town's justice of the peace, and she had the bearing of a woman who had appointed herself keeper of local standards without anyone asking her to. She looked at Clara across a barrel of dried corn with the particular expression of someone who has already made their judgment and is simply waiting to deliver it. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, though Clara hadn't told her name and wondered how she knew it. Mrs. Forsythe, Clara said, because she'd done her own research in the few days she'd been in town long enough to talk to anyone. Mabel's eyebrows rose slightly. She hadn't expected to be recognized. Settling in all right? Yes, thank you. And the boy? The question had an edge that Clara caught but didn't react to. Must find it quite an adjustment. No father, all this. She gestured vaguely. Newness. Clara looked at her for a moment. He's very adaptable, she said. Mabel smiled in a way that was not warm. I imagine he'd have to be. A pause carefully timed. You know, people talk. In a town this size, they can't help it. There's some concern. She lowered her voice, as if this made it more appropriate, about the circumstances of the arrangement. Some people think that it isn't fair to Mr. Hayes. B, to be put in a position like that without his choosing. Clara held her shopping basket. She looked at Mabel Forsyth and thought, with cold clarity, you are one of them. You're the messenger for one of them. Either way, you're here to see if you can move me. I appreciate your concern, Clara said, and she made her voice pleasant in a way that required effort. Mr. Hayes has expressed himself on the matter. I'm comfortable leaving it there. She reached past Mabel for a bag of dried corn and put it in her basket. Thank you for the conversation. She walked to the counter and paid for her things and walked out, and she held herself together until she was back on the mule and out of sight of the main street. Then she let herself breathe. What Mabel Forsyth had said wasn't wrong exactly, and that was what made it stick. Clara was not unaware of the awkwardness of her position. She was not naive about what it looked like, or what it cost Colton in dignity, if nothing else to have had his name put on a letter he'd never approved. She wasn't there because she'd earned it. She was there because a group of men thought it would be funny. The question that had kept her awake last night was the same one facing her now. What did she do with that? She could be small about it. She could be grateful and careful and quiet and hope that staying out of the way would be enough. Or she could do what she'd actually been doing for the past 9 days, which was learn everything she could and build something real out of what she'd been handed. She chose the second one again. It was the only choice she'd ever known how to make. Storm hit on the 12th day. She'd known it was coming. She could read weather, the same way she could read soil and people, with the particular attention of someone who'd had to learn to anticipate things rather than react to them. She'd spent the 2 days before it buttoning up what she could. Extra wood stacked under the overhang. The animals moved to the barn's inner stalls. The food stores checked and supplemented. Colton had watched her preparations with the kind of expression that was not quite skeptical and not quite approving, just observant. Like he was filing information. When it came, it was worse than she'd anticipated. Wasn't snow, not quite yet. Too early in the season for that, but it was a driving, horizontal rain with enough cold behind it that it might as well have been. She woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of something giving way and lay still for one breath, two identifying the sound. Not the roof. The roof was holding the barn, something on the east side of the barn. She was up the ladder before she'd fully decided to move. Colton was already pulling on his coat when she reached the bottom of the ladder. He'd heard it too. Looked at her. She was already dressed. She'd slept in most of her clothes. She'd learned to do that in uncertain places, and he grabbed the lantern and said, "Stay with the boy. Guy's asleep. He'll be fine." She pulled her coat from the peg. "What do you need?" A pause, quick, like he was deciding whether to argue. Then he handed her the lantern and took a second one from the shelf. "Hold it high. Walk close." They went out into the storm together. The east wall of the barn had sheared away at the foundation on the lower third old lumber, poorly attached, a weak point she'd noticed when she was looking around on her first day there and had filed away as a thing that would matter eventually. It had mattered in the worst possible moment. The cattle in the interior stalls were spooked and moving, and the rain was getting in, and the temperature was dropping fast. They worked for 3 hours. There were points during those 3 hours that Clara was not certain they were winning. There was a moment holding a plank against the gap while Colton drove a nail in the rain, the lantern swinging, wind shrieking when she thought, "This is too big. This is too much. We can't hold this." Then she held the plank, and Colton drove the nail. And they went to the next gap. By 6 a.m, the wall was patched well enough to hold, and the cattle had settled, and they were both soaked through and shaking with cold. They stood inside the barn, in the gray early light, with the storm still going outside, and neither of them said anything for a long moment. "East wall needs to be rebuilt," Clara said finally. Teeth were trying to chatter, and she was clenching her jaw against it. "I know," he said. "I can help with the labor, but you'll need lumber." She thought about what she knew of his finances, which was not much, but was something. "I have $11. He looked at her. His expression was different than it had been. She couldn't name it exactly. Like something had moved behind his eyes. "Keep it," he said. "Colton." She said his name for the first time, and it came out matter-of-fact, not soft. "Let me be useful. I didn't come here to be kept." We looked at her for a long time. The wind was still going outside, rattling the repaired planks, and the cattle shifted and breathed around them in the warm animal dark. "I'll think about the lumber," he said. "Come inside before you freeze." She followed him back to the house. She was thinking about the southwest field, Ran the trade routes she'd seen on the hand-drawn map she'd found folded in the kitchen drawer, and the possibilities that were starting to take a shape in her mind. She was thinking about what Mabel Forsythe had said, and what Barton Cruel had meant by that satisfied smile, and she was thinking about her son asleep in the loft and the wooden horse that had belonged to her father. She was thinking, I am not leaving this place. She was thinking, I don't care what any of them planned. Inside, the fire had burned down to coals. She built it back up and put the kettle on and sat at the table while her clothes steamed. Colton sat across from her and didn't say anything, and outside the storm went on. Eli came down from the loft at 7 with his hair wild and his wooden horse in one hand, looked at them both with enormous, unsurprised eyes. Gee, and said, Is it still raining? Still raining, Clara said. He climbed onto his chair and set the horse on the table and regarded it seriously. That's okay, he said. We're inside. Colton looked at the boy. Something in his face, just for a moment, shifted like a door opening a crack. Clara saw it, and she looked back at her tea, and she didn't say anything. The storm passed, but what it left behind didn't. The east wall of the barn stood patched and ugly, mismatched lumber, nail heads still bright against the old gray wood, gaps stuffed with whatever had been close at hand in the dark. Held. That was what mattered, and Clara had learned early in her life not to be too proud about how things held together so long as they did. Used what you had, you made it work. You moved on to the next problem. Problem, as it turned out, was money. She understood the ranch's finances the way she understood most things she needed to understand by watching carefully and asking the right questions at the right moments. Colton wasn't secretive about it, exactly. He was just a man who hadn't spoken his troubles aloud to anyone in so long that he'd nearly forgotten they could be spoken. When she asked, he answered. When she pushed, he went quiet for a while, and then answered anyway, like the words came out eventually, because they had no better place to go. What she pieced together over the 2 weeks following the storm was this. Ranch ran on cattle sales. Cattle sales happened twice a year at the Billings market, and the last sale had come up short because prices were down across the territory, and Colton had lost 4 head to a sickness that moved through the herd in August. Barn wall repair was going to cost money he didn't fully have. Winter feed stores needed to be supplemented. There was a debt not enormous, but real owed to the Raven Creek Merchants Bank, which was, Clara learned without surprise, substantially controlled by Barton Crowell. She let that last piece sit with her for a few days before she said anything about it. In the meantime, she planted. Not literally, the ground was too cold for that now, the season already turning, the first hard frost coming in the second week after the storm. What she planted was the idea, and she planted it the way she planted everything, with patience and with an eye toward what the ground could actually hold. She had laid out the rough numbers at the kitchen table one evening, on the back of a brown paper bag, because that was what was at hand. Colton had looked at them from across the table with the expression of a man who does not particularly enjoy looking at numbers, but has the self-discipline not to look away. If the Southwest field produces by summer, she said, you can supply grain to the 2 cattle operations east of here that are currently buying from Billings. Transport cost alone makes your price competitive, even if you start low. He said nothing. The Harding spread and the Kellerman operation, she continued. I talked to Marcus Harding's wife at the dry goods store on Thursday. Paying 12 cents a bushel, more than they need to, because it's coming from too far away. Colton looked at her. When did you talk to Nora Harding? Thursday, she said again. What were you doing at the dry goods store on Thursday? Getting salt and talking to people. She said it flat, matter of fact, because she wasn't going to apologize for gathering information. You can't plan anything without knowing the ground. Quiet for a moment. He picked up the paper bag and looked at her numbers. She'd always had a facility for arithmetic. It was one of those things that people hadn't expected of her, and she'd learned not to announce it, but just to let it be useful when useful was what was needed. Field needs work before it can produce, he said. I know. I've been looking at it. The fallow time is actually an advantage. The soil composition is good, better than it would be if it had been pushed hard for 8 years. But we need to turn it before the ground freezes hard. She paused. If we start next week, we can get most of it turned before that happens. Looked at her across the table, and she could see him doing the calculation, not the arithmetic, but something else. Something about whether he trusted what she was telling him, and whether he trusted her ability to know what she was telling him. I haven't farmed that land in 8 years, he said. I know, she said, I have, not that land, but land like it, and the principle was the same. She'd farmed her father's land from the time she was old enough to hold a hoe until the year she turned 19 and made the first of her bad decisions. She knew what turned soil felt like. She knew how to read it. Set the paper bag down. We start Monday, he said. Nah. They worked the southwest field in the short hours of morning light, before the temperature climbed enough to make the frozen crust workable, and before Colton had to move to the cattle. Clara drove the plow, she'd asked him once, without preamble. If he knew how to manage the thing, he'd said he did it well enough, but she was welcome to it. She'd taken the plow lines without further discussion. Turned out she had a stronger feel for it than he did, which neither of them commented on, but both of them noticed. Eli was too small to help much but too energetic to leave in the house alone, so he followed along the furrow lines, picking up earthworms and examining them with the concentrated interest of a very small scientist. He had a coffee tin he was collecting them in, for reasons he hadn't fully explained. "What are you going to do with those?" Colton asked him, on the third morning, not looking up from the post he was driving at the field's corner. "Put them back," he said. "After I count them." "How many so far?" 43. "But I might have counted some twice." He peered into the tin. "Move around." Colton drove the post. Eli went back to his counting. Clara kept the plow line steady and did not look at either of them, but she was aware with a precision that surprised her of the fact that that was the longest conversation she'd heard Colton initiate with anyone. Invitation to Crowell's dinner came on a Wednesday. Arrived by way of Crowell's man, a thin fellow named Asa who wore his hat too low and had the apologetic manner of someone doing a job he wasn't proud of, came to the door while Colton was at the far end of the property and handed Clara the envelope without quite meeting her eyes. She read it and set it on the table and thought about it while she made lunch. Barton Crowell was inviting Colton Hayes, and the letter said household to a dinner at his property on Saturday, along with several other prominent landowners in the area. Framed as a neighborly occasion, it was not a neighborly occasion. Clara had been around enough men like Crowell to know that when they extend an invitation with both hands, they're holding something else behind their back. Colton came in at noon. She handed him the letter and went back to the stove. He read it. She heard the paper fold. "No," he said. "We should go," she said. A pause. "Why?" She turned around and leaned against the counter. "'Cause refusing tells him he's got something you're afraid of. Going tells you what he's actually planning." He looked at her steadily. The letter was in his hand, folded in thirds. "And what do you think he's planning?" "I don't know yet," she said. "That's why we should go." He set the letter on the table and sat down, and Clara put the food in front of him and sat across from him, and they were quiet for a moment. Outside, Eli was in the yard talking to one of the chickens in a detailed and serious way about something. "He's going to try to make something of you being here," Colton said. Not an accusation, a statement directed at the table surface. "Probably," she said. "He's been trying to make something of me being here since the platform. That's not going to stop because we stay home on Saturday." He picked up his fork. "Put it down. You understand what you'd be walking into." "I've been walking into things like that my whole life," she said. "I'm still here." He looked at her, and she held the look. She didn't make it into anything more than what it was, which was one person telling another person a fact about themselves. "I'll think about it," he said. By Thursday evening, he'd said yes. She had one good dress. She'd known when she packed in Billings that she was not packing for a social life, and she'd prioritized practical things over anything else. She had one good dress, dark blue wool, collar that she'd repaired herself, with small, careful stitches you couldn't see if you weren't looking for them, and she put it on Saturday evening and pinned her hair up properly and looked at herself in the small, cracked mirror above the washstand and thought, "This will do." Eli stayed with old Mrs. Packett, who lived a half-mile down the road and whose tolerance for small boys was surprisingly high. Clara had met her at the dry goods store 2 weeks prior and found her sharp and unsentimental, and entirely without the particular brand of judgment that seemed to move through certain Raven Creek women like weather. Mrs. Packett had said Eli could come any time, which Clara suspected was as much about the company as about any generosity, but she didn't judge a motive that got her what she needed. Drove to Crowell's property in the wagon. It was a clear, cold night, and the stars were out, and neither of them said much. Clara had her hands folded in her lap, and she was going over, in her mind, everything she knew about the people who would be there. She'd done her research, the same way she did all her research, carefully, quietly, in the margins of conversations that looked like they were about other things. Colton's profile was sharp against the dark. He'd put on a clean shirt and a jacket that fit him better than she'd expected, and he drove with the same unhurried economy of motion he brought to everything else. "Are you nervous?" she asked. He glanced at her. "No." "Good," she said. "Don't be." Something at the corner of his mouth shifted, not quite a smile, but the shape of one briefly considered. "I wasn't asking for advice." "I know," she said, and she looked back at the road. Crowell House was the largest in the county, which it had been built to be. Sat at the end of a long drive lined with lanterns, and the windows were lit, and the sound of conversation came out into the cold air even before they'd stopped the wagon. Clara counted the horses at the rail 8, which meant the other guests had already arrived, and took stock of what she was about to walk into. Crowell met them at the door himself. He was a man in his late 50s, broad-shouldered once, and now running to weight in a way that his clothes tried and mostly failed to accommodate. He had a large face and a wide smile and the particular quality of warmth that some powerful men wear so long it stops being performance and becomes something they've actually started to believe. He looked at Clara with an expression of expansive welcome that she understood immediately was the opening move of something else. "Hayes," he said, extending his hand. "Glad you could make it." And he looked at Clara with precisely the right amount of surprise, as if he hadn't spent considerable time thinking about this moment. "You must be the missus." "Clara Whitmore," she said. She shook his hand before he could offer it to Colton first, which was a small thing but mattered. "Remarkable," he said. He was doing something with his eyes, measuring, comparing what he saw against whatever he'd built in his head. She gave him nothing back but pleasant attention. Come in, come in." Inside, the house was warm and crowded with the kind of comfort that money buys when it has had time to settle. There were 8 other guests, 4 couples, which made Clara and Colton conspicuous in their ambiguity, and she was aware of the looks that flickered toward them as they entered. She recognized 2 of the men. Tom Kellerman from the Eastern Spread, who she'd heard was decent and practical, and Judge Forsyth, Mabel's husband, whose expression managed to be simultaneously welcoming and assessing. Mabel Forsyth was there too. Of course she was. The dinner itself was not where the real conversation happened. Dinners like this were staging areas you learned what you needed to learn, from what people said with the table between you, the small jabs wrapped in pleasantry, the questions that were shaped like curiosity and functioned like probes. Clara ate well, the food was genuinely good, and she'd been tired of her own cooking, and she listened more than she spoke, which was what she'd planned. Kroll directed most of his attention at Colton across the table. It was transparent once you saw the pattern. He talked about the territory, coming winter, difficulty of the market. He talked about the pressures facing small operations. He talked about how hard it was for a man to keep land in this country when the banks were tightening and the prices were soft. He delivered all of it with the manner of a concerned neighbor, a man who understood the hardship, a man who had himself once faced what these others were facing. Every word of it was designed to make Colton feel the ground shifting under him. Clara watched Colton's face and saw him holding very still, the way he did when he was receiving information and deciding what to do with it. He wasn't giving Crowell much back. He said little, answered directly when he had to, and did not agree with anything. Kellerman, who said, across the table, a little too casually, "I heard there was some trouble with the east barn wall, Colton. Storm was rough this year." "Handled it," Colton said. "Good, good." Kellerman nodded. He was the kind of man who meant well, and had nevertheless been standing next to the wrong people long enough that some of it had rubbed off. Must help to have extra hands now. There was a beat of something in the room, one of those moments where the surface stays smooth and everything underneath shifts. Clara picked up her water glass. "It does," she said simply. Kellerman looked at her with what seemed like genuine surprise, not that she'd spoken, but that her voice had been so completely without apology or explanation. Nodded slowly, like something was being revised. Crowell smiled. "I imagine the arrangement has been useful," he said. Word arrangement sat in the air and stayed there. Clara looked at him, and she kept her face pleasant. "Marriage generally is," she said. Crowell's smile didn't break, but something behind it did a slight recalibration, quick enough that she almost missed it. Mabel Forsyth was watching Clara with the focused attention of someone who has come expecting one thing and found another. On the way home, Colton didn't speak for the first mile. Stars were still out, and the cold had sharpened, and the horses moved at an easy pace through the dark. "He's going to move on the debt," Colton said finally. "I know," Clara said. "He's building a case for it." Dinner was about witnesses getting people in the room before he does it, so it looks like he gave you every consideration. Silence. The wagon moved. How long have you known that? He asked. Since the platform, she said. People who arrange jokes like that aren't finished when the joke lands. They're waiting to see what advantage it opens up. He was quiet again. She could feel him processing it, the way he processed most things thoroughly, without hurry. He holds the note on the back 40, Colton said. Bank calls it, I have 60 days. She'd suspected something like this, but hadn't known the specific shape. What's on the back 40? Water, he said. The creek runs through it. Without that creek, the cattle operation doesn't function. She absorbed this. A rancher without water access was a rancher with nothing, and Crowell would know that as well as she did. Better, probably. The southwest field, she said. Is any of it on the back 40? The east section of it. Yes. She looked out at the dark road ahead of them. Plan she'd been building in her mind rearranged itself slightly. The way a structure rearranges when you find out the load is heavier than you thought. Didn't collapse. It just needed different supports. Then we work faster, she said. He looked at her. In the dark, she couldn't fully read his expression, but she could feel the weight of it. You don't have to do this, he said. And it came out low, and without any performance around it, not gratitude, not deflection, just a statement of fact from a man who was not used to accepting help and understood that he was accepting it. I know, she said. I want to. He looked back at the road. Why? He asked. It was the most direct question he'd asked her since she arrived, and she gave it the honesty it deserved. Because it's a good piece of land, and it deserves better than what's being done to it. And because Eli needs a home, and this is the closest thing to one I've found. She paused. And because I don't like Barton Crowell, she added. Corner of his mouth moved definitely this time, and it was not quite a smile, but it was the honest predecessor to one, and she turned back to the road and didn't push it. Next week was the hardest of all of them. They worked the field in the mornings, building the furrows deeper, amending the soil with what they could get from the barn. Clara wrote 3 letters, one to a trading post 40 miles east that she'd read about in a notice, one to a seed supplier whose name she'd gotten from Nora Harding, one to a woman in Billings who'd once run a small agricultural lending operation that Clara had heard about secondhand from a conversation in a general store 3 years ago that she hadn't known she was filing away for later use. This was how her mind worked. It took in everything and stored it in a place she couldn't always access directly, and then something would surface it when she needed it. Colton watched her writing the letters at the kitchen table one evening and didn't say anything for a while. Then who's the third letter to? A woman named Ardith Crane, Clara said. She ran agricultural lending out of Billings. She may not be doing it anymore, but it's worth asking. Know her? No, I heard about her. He was quiet. From who? A man in a general store who was complaining that a woman had turned down his loan application. She kept writing. Said she had unreasonable standards. That usually means she had standards. She could feel him looking at her. She signed the letter and folded it and set it with the others. I'll mail them on Thursday, she said. He said, all right. Not yes, not thank you. Just all right, which was Colton's version of trust. She understood by then what it cost him. She didn't make anything more of it than she needed to. She was in town mailing the letters on Thursday when she saw Pete Garlow. She saw him before he saw her, which meant she had the advantage of choosing whether to acknowledge him or not. She chose to acknowledge him because she had learned that people who don't look at things head-on tend to be surprised by them later. Mr. Garlow, she said. He had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. He was a man of about 30, with the particular combination of weak chin and loud laugh that indicated someone who understood himself primarily in relation to what the men around him thought of him. He was one of the 6 who had laughed on the platform. She had not forgotten any of their faces, Mrs. He started, and then he got tangled because he wasn't sure what to call her. Whitmore, she said pleasantly. How are you? Fine, he said. Fine. He looked at the letters in her hand with something that was trying to be casual. Busy week, she said, and moved toward the post office window. Said to her back, You're still out there then? Hayes place. She turned back. Yes, she said. We've been working the southwest field. You know that field? Beautiful soil. Should have a good first yield in the summer. She let that sit. Do you have family in farming, Mr. Garlow? He blinked. No, shame, she said. There's nothing more honest than farming. She turned back to the window and handed over her letters. Good day. She walked out of the post office and didn't let herself feel anything until she was around the corner, and then she let herself feel all of it for about 30 seconds, the anger, humiliation that had not gone away just because she'd refused to show it, the sharp-edged satisfaction of having walked through a conversation with him and come out standing, and then she filed it away and walked back to the mule and went home. The letter from Ardith Crane arrived 18 days later. It was not a refusal, and it was not an agreement. It was a question, a very particular, very pointed question about the soil composition of the southwest field and the existing debt structure of the property and the terms of the trade route Clara had mentioned in her letter. Clara sat at the table and read it 3 times. Then she read it to Colton, listened without interrupting, which by now she understood was his form of close attention. "She wants to know if we have collateral beyond the field," she said. "Tell her about the field. What I knew. What I'd tested." She set the letter down. "She's not saying no. She's saying she needs more information. That's different." "She's in Billings," he said. "She doesn't know this land." "No," Clara said, "but she knows numbers. And the numbers are solid." She looked at him across the table. "I need to go to Billings." He looked at her for a moment. "It's 4 days," he said. 3.5 if the weather holds," she said. "Eli can stay with Mrs. Packett. She's already offered." He was quiet, and she knew he was working through something that was not logistics. She waited. "What do you need to take with you?" he asked finally. She let out a breath that she hadn't fully known she was holding. "Soil tests I did. The yield projections, the maps." "I'll get the maps," he said. "The ones from my father's time, too. She should see how the field produced before." Clara looked at him across the table in the warm kitchen light, and he was looking at the table surface and not at her. She thought that this was what trust looked like in a man like Colton Hayes, not words and not gestures. But the act of getting up and finding the maps from his father's time and handing them over so that someone else could carry them somewhere he hadn't been able to go. "Thank you," she said. He stood up and went to look for the maps and didn't answer. And she sat at the table and thought about the southwest field and Barton Crowell and a woman in Billings with unreasonable standards. She thought that maybe the shape of what she'd been building was finally close enough to stand in. She left for Billings on a Tuesday morning. Colton brought the wagon around before she'd finished packing, and he'd put in extra blankets without being asked, which she noted and didn't comment on. Eli had cried for exactly 4 minutes when they'd said goodbye at Mrs. Packett's, the brief functional grief of a child who is mostly confident in the people around him, but reserves the right to protest anyway. And then he'd gone inside to look at Mrs. Packett's very old dog with the focused interest of someone who has already found the next interesting thing. She and Colton drove to the rail junction in the gray morning light, and when she got down from the wagon with her bag, he handed her the maps carefully folded in oilskin paper and her own letters to Ardith Crane, which she needed as reference. 3.5 days, he said. "Give or take," she said. She picked up her bag. He was standing by the wagon with his hands at his sides and his face doing the thing it did when he was sorting through something he didn't have language for yet. "I'll be back," she said. Not a reassurance, a fact. "Gum." He nodded once. She walked toward the platform and didn't look back, but she was aware in the particular way she'd become aware of Colton Hayes over the past weeks that he stood there and watched until the train was out of sight. She didn't know entirely what to do with that, except to carry it with her into Billings like one more thing worth protecting. Train moved east through the morning, and the mountains fell behind it. Clara sat with the oilskin maps on her lap and the numbers in her head and thought about all the ways this could go wrong and all the ways. She was careful and precise and absolutely refused to be anything less than herself. It might not. Ardith Crane was not what Clara had expected, which by now she was used to things not being what she expected and had stopped counting it against them. She had imagined someone severe, a woman who ran lending operations in a territory where men controlled almost everything financial would have to be severe. Clara had reasoned would have to have built walls so high and so thick that nothing got through that she hadn't approved in advance. Looknit. She'd prepared herself for a difficult meeting. She'd gone over her numbers on the train until she could recite them without looking at the paper. What she found was a woman of about 60 in a comfortable office above a feed supplier on Billings Main Street, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and ink on her right index finger, and a cup of tea going cold on the corner of her desk. Ardith Crane had the face of someone who had been pretty once and had traded it for something better, a kind of settled sharpness, a quality of attention that made you feel, when she looked at you, she was actually seeing you rather than the version of you that you'd prepared to present. She looked at Clara for a long moment after Clara sat down. "You're younger than your letter," she said. "I'm 28, Clara said. Your letter sounded like someone who'd been doing this 20 years. She picked up her tea, found it cold, and set it back down. Compliment. I understood it that way, Clara said. Ardith almost smiled. She pulled Clara's letter from a folder on her desk and set it in front of her and looked at it, though Clara suspected she'd already memorized it. Southwest Field, 15 acres of fallow ground. Closer to 18, now that I've walked the full boundary. Fence line was off. The soil tests you mentioned. Clara opened her bag and put the papers on the desk, the tests she'd done herself. Rough but methodical. Yield projections she'd calculated from what she knew of comparable soil in comparable climates. Then the maps, still in their oilskin wrapping. These are from the original farming period, his father's records. You can see what the field produced before it was let go. Ardith unwrapped the oilskin carefully, the way someone handles something they understand has value. She spread the maps on the desk and looked at them for a long time without speaking. Clara let her look. The debt structure, Ardith said finally, not looking up from the maps. Note on the back 40 held by the Raven Creek Merchants Bank, Clara said. Bank has substantial ties to a landowner named Barton Crowell. Ardith looked up at that Crowell. It was one word, but the quality of it told Clara something. You know him? I know of him. She set the map down. He's been moving on small operations in that part of the territory for 6 years. Buying up debt, calling notes, acquiring water rights. She looked at Clara steadily. You understand that lending against a property with that kind of encumbrance is risky. I understand that not lending against it is a certainty, Clara said. If the note gets called before we can demonstrate income from the field, there's nothing to negotiate with. Ardith was quiet. She looked at the maps again, then at Clara's yield projections. Did these calculations yourself? Yes. Where did you learn the methodology? My father's farm, Clara said, and reading, and paying attention. Ardith picked up her cold tea again, seemed to remember it was cold, and set it down again. Mrs. Whitmore, she said, I'm going to tell you something that I don't normally tell people who come into this office. Clara waited. The reason I'm still doing this work, Ardith said, is because I got tired of watching capable people lose land to men who were simply better positioned. That's not a sentiment, it's an observation. And when I read your letter, I thought, this is someone who knows exactly what she's up against, and came anyway. She folded her hands on the desk. I have terms. They're not easy terms, but they're real. Clara said, tell me the terms. She was back in Raven Creek in 3 days and 4 hours, which was slightly better than she'd projected. Wagon was waiting at the rail junction. She saw it from the platform, and then saw Colton standing beside it, arms crossed watching the train slow. She walked toward him, and he didn't move to meet her, just waited, and when she got close enough, she held up the folded document in her hand. She said yes, Clara said. He looked at the document. His face didn't move much, but something in his posture shifted a barely perceptible easing, like a board that's been under load for a long time and has just had a small piece of the weight taken off. Terms, he said. Manageable, she said. I'll explain on the way. She took her bag, and she climbed up to the seat, and he went around to his side, and they drove back through the late afternoon light. And she explained the terms the way she explained most things to Colton directly, without softening anything, because she'd learned by now that he didn't need softening, and in fact was slightly offended by it. Interest rate was higher than she'd wanted. The repayment schedule was tight but not impossible given the yield projections. Ardith Crane had put a clause in about the water rights that was smart. It provided a mechanism for contesting Crowell's position on the back 40 through a channel that wasn't the bank, which was the most important piece of all of it. Colton listened without interrupting. When she finished, they were a mile from the ranch, the familiar fence line coming into view on the left. She put the water rights clause in herself? He asked. Yes, Clara said. She knows how Crowell works. He was quiet for a moment. This woman Crane, she doesn't know us. No, Clara said. She took the risk. She took a calculated risk, Clara said, based on numbers that held up. And she paused, deciding to say the rest of it. I think she's made it her business to watch men like Crowell and make sure they don't win every time they try. Colton considered this. Why? Clara looked at the fence line going past. She didn't say, but she had the look of someone who had a reason. He nodded once, slowly, and they pulled up to the yard, and the chickens scattered, and the mules in the near paddock lifted their heads briefly before going back to the dry grass. Everything was the same as she'd left it, the same. And somehow she noticed this with a surprise she didn't fully understand, like something she'd been away from, rather than something she'd been escaping. She was still sitting with that thought when Eli came running from Mrs. Pack's direction. The old woman must have seen the wagon from her window and hit Clara at full speed with the particular impact of a 4-year-old who has been exercising patience for 3 days and is completely done with it. She caught him, and he wrapped his arms around her neck and said into her shoulder, with great feeling, "You were gone so long." 3 days, she said. That's very long, he said, as though this were an objective measurement she ought to know. She held him and looked over his head at the ranch, in the last light, the patched barn wall, the cold fields, the mountains behind it all, and she felt something settle in her that had been moving since she'd stepped off the train in Raven Creek with $11 and a carpet bag and a boy who counted earthworms. 3 weeks after she came back from Billings, Colton found out what Crowell was actually planning, and it was worse than either of them had anticipated. Came through Tom Kellerman, which surprised Clara slightly. She'd assessed Kellerman as a man who moved with the dominant current, and the dominant current in Raven Creek had been Crowell's for a long time. Kellerman showed up at the ranch on a gray Wednesday morning while Clara was at the field and Colton was in the barn. Ronnie stood in the yard turning his hat in his hands and said what he'd come to say with the discomfort of someone doing a thing they're not sure they have the courage for. Clara came in from the field and saw Kellerman's horse at the rail and went inside and found the 2 men at the table with coffee that Colton had clearly made. It was stronger than anything she'd have produced. Strong enough to strip paint, and she sat down without being invited, and Kellerman looked at her, and then at Colton, and then back at his hat. "Who's calling the note?" Kellerman said. "I heard it at Crowell's property yesterday. He told Asa he'd be sending the bank's man out by end of the month." Colton's face went very still. "The 60-day clock," Clara said. "Yes." Kellerman turned his hat. "I know it's not. I know I haven't been." He stopped. "Tried again. My wife said I should come." "Your wife was right," Clara said. Kellerman looked at her. She could see something in his face that was trying to be more than what he'd allowed it to be at Crowell's dinner, something that was working against years of standing in the wrong place, because it was easier than standing somewhere else. "Is there anything?" He started. "We've already moved on it," Clara said. "But I need you to tell me exactly what he said. The exact words, if you remember them." Kellerman told her. He was a good observer. She realized he'd listened carefully, and he reproduced it accurately. Crowell had said he was calling the note on the grounds of an imminent default risk. He'd cited the barn damage from the storm, the soft cattle market, the general instability of the operation. He had the language of a man who had rehearsed his justification in advance, which meant he had the language of a man who had been planning this for longer than the storm. When Kellerman was done, Clara looked at Colton. Colton was looking at the table surface, and she recognized that look by now. It was not defeat, and it was not rage. It was the particular expression of a man who has just confirmed a thing he already knew was coming, and is now making the adjustment from dreading it to dealing with it. "How long ago did he set this up?" Colton asked. Not of Kellerman. "Clara. The platform," she said. "The arrangement with the agency. He needed you distracted, and he needed something to point to as evidence of instability." She paused. "Supposed to be the evidence." Word we sat in the air for a moment, and neither of them addressed it directly. But Kellerman noticed it. She could tell, because something shifted in his expression. "I'm sorry," Kellerman said. He was talking to both of them, and he meant it, which was something. "Don't be sorry," Clara said. "Be useful. If Crowell calls that note and we contest the grounds, we're going to need people who heard him plan it to say so." Kellerman went still. He stopped. "I'm not asking you to do it today," she said. "I'm asking you to think about what's right." He stood up and put his hat on and looked at Colton. "She always talked this direct?" "Yes," Colton said. Kellerman nodded, once and left. They had 26 days. Clara knew this because she counted from the date Kellerman had given her, counted forward to end of month, and put the number in her head and kept it there like a compass bearing. 26 days from everything coming apart in a way that Ardith Crane's lending agreement might not be fast enough to counter, because the terms of the contest clause required documentation that took time to assemble. Time was the thing Crowell was now explicitly controlling. She wrote to Ardith Crane that same evening. She was direct. She explained the accelerated timeline and asked what could be done about the documentation within the new constraints. She mailed it the next morning. And then she did what she always did when circumstances tightened. She went back to work. Southwest Field was her clearest immediate argument, not a legal argument, a visible one. The field that had been turned and amended and planted with winter rye as a soil conditioner was a field that was demonstrably active, Demonstrably productive, demonstrably part of an operation that was building rather than failing. She couldn't change the debt on paper in 26 days, but she could change what the land looked like. She had learned from watching men like Crowell operate that visible evidence mattered enormously to people who decided these things from the outside. Colton understood this without needing it explained. Yeah. They worked the field in the mornings and the cattle in the afternoons, and neither of them talked much during the work itself. But in the evenings at the table, there was a different quality to the silence than there had been at the beginning. It had weight now, but not distance. It was the silence of two people who have been working toward the same thing long enough that they've stopped needing to explain every step of it. Eli, for his part, was thriving in the way that small children thrive when they are given a consistent place and consistent people, and enough physical activity to exhaust themselves properly each day. He had adopted the ranch with the wholehearted commitment that 4-year-olds bring to things they decide to love. He had named 2 of the cattle, a decision Colton had not encouraged and had also not discouraged, and he had an ongoing relationship with the largest of the barn cats, whom he called Governor, who tolerated Eli's attention with the resigned dignity of a cat who has decided the trade-off is worth it for the scraps. One evening, near the end of the second week after Kellerman's visit, Clara looked up from her figures at the table to find Eli asleep in the chair across from her, glisting sideways with his cheek against his arm, and Colton sitting in the doorway of the room he'd come in from the barn and hadn't said anything, just stopped there watching the boy sleep with an expression that Clara didn't have a name for. It wasn't paternal exactly. It wasn't distant exactly. It was something in between, the expression of a man who is slowly and against his better judgment becoming attached to something and has not yet decided whether to fight it. She looked back at her figures and didn't say anything, because some things need to be left alone to grow at their own pace. 12 days out, the bank's man arrived. His name was Doyle, a thin, precise man in a clerk's coat who arrived on a Tuesday morning and tied his horse at the rail and knocked on the door with the formal deliberateness of someone who has delivered unpleasant news for long enough to have developed a ritual around it. Clara opened the door. He looked at her and consulted a paper. "I'm looking for Colton Hayes," he said. "He's in the barn," she said. "I'm his wife. You can speak to me." Doyle looked at her for a moment, then decided correctly that arguing about this would take longer than he had patience for. "I have a note from the Raven Creek Merchants Bank regarding a note on the back 40 parcels of the Hayes property." "I know what you have," Clara said. "Would you like to come inside?" She made him coffee, the good coffee, not Colton's version, and she put the ledger on the table and she went through it with him, point by point, while Colton came in from the barn and sat across the table and said very little but was present, which was its own kind of statement. She showed Doyle the Ardith Crane lending agreement. She showed him the field documentation. She showed him the winter rye already establishing itself in the southwest sections, yield projections, assigned trade agreements she'd gotten from Nora Harding. 3 days ago, Nora had come to the ranch herself for that. Signed without the theater of deliberation, had said only that her husband would follow when he stopped being afraid, which Clara took as a yes. Doyle wrote things in a small notebook. He was not unkind, he was a functionary, and functionaries in Clara's experience were rarely the actual problem, just the instrument of it. "Note," Doyle said finally, "is being called on the grounds of imminent default risk," Clara said. "I know the grounds." "I'm telling you that the grounds don't exist." She turned the ledger so he could see it clearly. "This operation is not in default. It is not at imminent risk of default. It has an active lending agreement covering the contested period, active trade commitments for the coming season, and demonstrable improvements to the property value made in the last 60 days. Doyle looked at the ledger. He looked at Clara. He wrote in his notebook. "I'll need to take this to the bank," he said. "I know," she said. "Like a written receipt for every document you've reviewed here today. So there's a record of what was provided and when." He looked at her steadily. He wrote out the receipt without arguing. Colton walked him to his horse when he left. And when he came back inside, Clara was standing at the kitchen counter with her hands flat on the surface and her eyes closed, doing what she'd been doing since Doyle knocked on the door, which was holding the thing together from the inside through sheer force of will. She heard Colton come in. She heard him pour himself coffee. She heard the chair scrape. "You all right?" he asked. She opened her eyes. "Yes," she said, "that was the easy part." He looked at her. "The receipt was smart. He can still move on it," she said, pushing off the counter and sitting down across from him. "Documentation delays it. It doesn't stop it. Crowell will push back through the bank. She looked at her coffee cup. We need what Kellerman knows, and we need it on paper. Colton was quiet for a moment. He's not going to want to put it on paper. I know, she said. But he came here. He didn't have to come here. Colton turned his coffee cup in his hands. He had a habit of doing that when he was working through something, not restlessly, just methodically, like the physical action helped organize the thinking. I'll talk to him, Colton said. Clara looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his coffee cup, and she understood that this was something he was deciding to do, rather than something he was asking her about, which was significant because Colton Hayes, she had come to know, did not ask other people to carry things he thought were his to carry. Okay, she said. He nodded and went back to his coffee, and outside the wind had picked up, and the winter rye in the southwest field moved in it like something that was already alive. Town meeting was not something Clara had planned. It happened because Mabel Forsythe, of all people, called it. She came to the ranch on a Thursday, which was unexpected enough that Clara stood in the doorway for a moment, just looking at her before inviting her in. Mabel looked different from the last time Clara had seen her at the dry goods store, less constructed. Somehow, like a layer of something had been removed. She was still precise in her dress and careful in her manner, but there was something in her eyes that Clara hadn't seen there before. I owe you an apology, Mabel said, once she was sitting at the table with the coffee Clara had put in front of her. Clara sat across from her and waited. I said something to you in the dry goods store, Mabel said, about the circumstances of the arrangement, about whether it was fair to Mr. Hayes. She looked at her cup. It was unkind. I knew it was unkind when I said it. Clara looked at her. Why are you here now? Mabel was quiet for a moment. Because my husband told me last night that Barton Crowell has been moving on the Pfeiffer land as well. Pfeiffers have been here 20 years. She looked up, and I started counting how many he's done this to, and I stopped counting at 7 because I ran out of names I could be certain of. The room was quiet. The stove ticked. Your husband is the justice of the peace, Clara said. Yes, Mabel said. Does he know about Kellerman's testimony? What Crowell said at his property about calling the note? Mabel looked at her steadily. He knows some of it. I'd like to know more. Clara considered this for a moment. She thought about what she needed and what a town meeting could provide and what it could cost. And she thought about Ardith Crane's water rights clause and the receipt she'd gotten from Doyle and the 17 acres of winter rye growing in the southwest field, and she made the calculation. I'll need 3 days to prepare, she said. The meeting can be Friday, Mabel said. Friday works, Clara said. Mabel stood up and put on her coat and looked at Clara with the direct look of someone who is taking stock of something they misjudged. You're not what I expected, she said. I know, Clara said. Most people aren't what they're expected to be, if you give them room. Mabel nodded and left, and Clara sat at the table for a moment, and then she pulled a blank piece of paper toward her and started writing. She told Colton that evening. He took it better than she'd expected, which meant he was unhappy about it but didn't say so, which was Colton's version of acceptance. Town meeting, he said. With the justice of the peace, she said. Kellerman, if you got him to agree. He agreed, Colton said. Reluctantly. Reluctant is fine. Reluctant still counts. She looked at her papers. Crowell will be there. A pause. He'll be invited? He'll hear about it, she said. In a town this size, there's no such thing as a private meeting. He'll come because not coming looks like guilt, and coming looks like confidence, and he's always chosen confidence. She looked up. Point. I want him in the room. Colton looked at her. Expression was careful. What exactly are you planning to say? Truth, she said. Documented. She set the papers on the table and turned them so he could read the top sheet, the timeline she'd built. Starting from the advertisement, Crowell had placed with her name on it, and ending with Doyle's visit, and the receipt that put a date on what had been presented and when. Read it slowly. She watched his face. When he looked up, his expression had moved to something she'd seen on him, only a few times, a kind of settled, clear-eyed gravity that was not anger and not resignation, but something more purposeful than either. You've been building this since the platform, he said. Not building, she said. Noticing, organizing. She pulled the papers back. There's a difference. He was quiet for a long moment. Going to come at you hard, he said, in that room. Going to try to make it about you, about who you are, why you're here. I know, she said. And what do you do when he does that? She thought about it, not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to make sure she had it right before she said it. I let him, she said finally. Because every time he makes it about me, he's not making it about the 7 families he's moved on. And the room will notice that. Colton looked at her for a long time. All right, he said. It was the same word he'd used when she told him about the letters to Ardith Crane. The same word, but the weight of it had changed. There was less reservation in it now, and more of something else, something that Clara filed away carefully and did not examine too directly. The night before the meeting, she couldn't sleep. This was not new. She'd had years of practicing insomnia in situations where anxiety was the rational response, and her body refused to pretend otherwise. She lay in the loft with Eli breathing slow beside her, and she went over everything she had. Piece by piece. The way you pack a bag the night before a difficult journey. Was it all there? Was it organized? Was it ready? The ledger, the Crane agreement, the filed documentation from Doyle's visit, maps back in their oilskin wrapping, Kellerman's testimony, which he'd written out by hand in his plain, careful script and signed at the bottom. 2 letters from other landowners Mabel had quietly contacted people. Crowell had moved on in previous years who had lost quietly and alone because they hadn't known anyone else was losing at the same time. She had not gone looking for those letters. Mabel had produced them, had knocked on the ranch door 2 days ago and handed them over without preamble. Clara had read them at the table and then set them down and looked at the ceiling for a while. 7 families was what Mabel had said. The letters represented 2 of them, willing to be counted. That was something. The roosters started before the sun was fully up, and Clara heard Colton moving below the particular sounds of his morning, which she knew by now the way you know the sounds of a house you've lived in long enough, and she sat up and began to get dressed in the dark, moving carefully so as not to wake Eli. She had the blue wool dress. She had the facts. She had 18 days of work behind her and a room full of people ahead of her, some of whom wanted her to fail, and some of whom were waiting to see what failing looked like before they decided. She came down the ladder, and Colton was at the stove, and he handed her a cup of coffee without turning around. She took it and stood in the kitchen in the early light and thought, whatever happens today, I am not the person who stepped off that train with nothing. I have made something here. We have made something. Barton Crowell, for all his planning, did not plan for that. She drank the coffee. Outside, the winter rye in the southwest field was moving in the morning wind, all 17 acres of it, green and persistent and entirely, stubbornly alive. Meeting was held in the Raven Creek Assembly Hall, which was the largest interior space in town, and on ordinary occasions hosted things like harvest suppers and the occasional traveling medicine show. It had a plank floor that had never been fully level and windows along the south wall that let in good light when the weather cooperated and rattled in their frames when it didn't. That Friday morning it cooperated, mostly a pale winter sun coming through the glass and laying itself across the rows of chairs that someone had arranged the night before in anticipation of a crowd. Crowd came. Clara had not fully anticipated the size of it. She had known the meeting would draw people in a town like Raven Creek. A public assembly called by the Justice of the Peace on short notice drew people the way water drew cattle, simply because the alternatives were less interesting. She had not expected every seat filled and people standing along the back wall. She had not expected to see faces she recognized from the dry goods store, from the post office, from that first day on the platform, ranged in the chairs with the particular expression of people who have come because they understand, in some collective instinctive way, that something important is about to be decided. She came in with Colton, and she felt the room shift when they entered, not dramatically, not with any sound. Just the subtle change in attention that happens when the person everyone has been talking about walks through the door. She kept her face arranged and her pace steady, and she went to the table at the front that Judge Forsyth had set up, and she put her papers on it, and she sat down. Colton sat beside her. He did not look around the room. He looked at the table in front of him, which was his way of managing a situation he found difficult, and she did not try to change it. Crowell came in 7 minutes later. Came with 2 men she didn't recognize, not Raven Creek men, dressed too well for that, with the bearing of people who worked in offices in larger cities and had been brought in as a specific kind of reinforcement. He surveyed the room with the comfortable authority of a man who has never entered a space he didn't assume he could control, and when his eyes reached Clara, they stayed there for a moment, just a moment, calibrating, and then moved away with the dismissiveness of someone who has already decided how a thing will go. Sat in the front row. Not at a table. The choice was deliberate. He was making himself an audience member, a concerned citizen, a man who had simply come to observe. Clara had expected something like this. Judge Forsyth called the meeting to order from behind a standing desk at the side of the room. He was a careful man. Gerald Forsyth Clara had revised her assessment of him upward since Mabel's visit, the measured quality of someone who understood that his authority derived from the room's belief in it and treated that belief accordingly. He explained the purpose of the meeting in brief, neutral terms, a matter concerning land debt practices in the territory, documentation of which had been brought to his attention, which he believed warranted public airing before any further legal proceedings were initiated. He used the word documentation 4 times in 2 paragraphs, which Clara recognized as intentional. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, you've requested time to present. She stood up. The room was very quiet. She had thought on the wagon ride in about how to begin. She had written versions of it in her head and discarded most of them too formal, too legalistic, too much like an argument being made to a court rather than to a room full of people who grew crops and raised cattle and understood the territory the way you understand a place you have staked your life on. She had settled, in the end, on the same approach she'd used with Ardith Crane and with Doyle and with Kellerman, direct, clear, without softening. I came to Raven Creek 11 weeks ago, she said. I had $11, a 4-year-old boy, and a letter from a mail-order bride agency that had been answered by someone other than the man whose name was on it. Room shifted. Not much, but she felt it. I'm not here to talk about that, she said before anyone could redirect toward it. I'm here to talk about what that letter was for, because it wasn't a joke. Not really. She picked up the timeline she'd prepared, 1 clean page, dates and facts, nothing embellished. Strategy. She laid out the timeline the way she'd practiced it, point by point. Advertisement placed without Colton's knowledge. Timing of it coinciding with the soft cattle market and the storm season, when a rancher's operation would look its most precarious. Dinner at Crowell's property, which she described as what it was, a gathering of witnesses to a narrative Crowell was building about the Hayes Ranch's instability. Doyle's visit, the grounds cited for calling the note, spoke for 8 minutes without interruption, which surprised her. She had expected Crowell to object, to redirect, to perform something. Sat in the front row with his hands folded and his expression composed. Begin, and he let her speak. And she understood midway through that this was also a strategy letting her lay it out, made it easier to dismantle piece by piece afterward. Made him look reasonable and patient, and her look like someone making accusations. When she finished, she sat down. Judge Forsyth looked at the room. Crowell, you've heard the presentation. Do you wish to respond? Crowell stood. He moved to the center of the floor the way a man moves when he has done this before unhurried, comfortable in the space, and he looked at Clara with an expression of such patient, benevolent tolerance that she felt her jaw tighten. I have a great deal of respect, he said, for a woman who has clearly worked hard and clearly cares for her family. He paused to let the room absorb his generosity. I have no wish to make this personal. Another pause. But I think we should be honest about what's happening here. The woman arrived in this town under unusual circumstances. She's been here 11 weeks, and she's come to a public meeting to accuse one of this community's longest-standing members of what exactly? He spread his hands. Bank calling a note on a struggling operation is standard practice. It's not a conspiracy, it's business. He said a few more things along those lines carefully, hitting the notes of reason and regret, and then he sat down. The room was quiet. Clara had known this moment would come, and she had known what she was going to do in it, and she stood up again before Forsyth could speak. Mr. Crowell said this community's longest-standing members, she said. I'd like to ask the room a question. She looked out at the assembled faces, the farmers, the shopkeepers, ranchers' wives, who had come and sat in the chairs with the stillness of people who have been deciding something for a long time and are waiting for the moment that permits them to decide it out loud. How many of you have lost land in this territory in the last 6 years, or know someone who has? Silence held for a moment. Then a man in the third row, she didn't know him, older, weather-beaten. Hands that had done 30 years of physical work raised his hand. Slowly, like he was testing the weight of the action. Then another. Then 2 more. Then a woman near the back wall who did it quickly, like she'd decided before the question was fully out. 7 hands. 8. 9. Crowell's composed expression did not break, but something at the edge of it shifted something small and very quickly corrected. But Clara had been watching for it. I have 2 letters, she said, from families who have given me permission to present them here. She picked them up. The Halverson family lost their eastern parcel 4 years ago when a note was called on 30 days' notice citing imminent default on an operation that their neighbors will tell you was entirely solvent. She set the first letter on the table in front of Forsyth. The Brower family lost their water access 2 years ago through a bank decision that transferred the water rights on their rear parcels to a private holding entity. She set the second letter beside the first. That holding entity is registered in Helena. Its principal owner is Barton Crowell. Room moved. It was not silence anymore. It was the sound of a room that has just had something confirmed that it had been feeling for a long time without the language to name it. Crowell stood again. He did not wait to be recognized. Those letters are unverified, he started. They're signed, Clara said, and witnessed. The witnessing signatures are on the back. The letter is not a legal instrument. No, she said. It's a testimony. From people who were moved against one at a time, quietly, before anyone could compare what was happening to them to what was happening to their neighbors. She looked at him. Not with anger, she had taken the anger out of her voice deliberately, because anger was what he wanted, because anger would let him redirect the room toward whether she was reasonable rather than whether she was right. Counted on that. You counted on people not talking to each other. Crowell looked at her for a moment, and she saw it clearly now, not the benevolent neighbor. Not the patient businessman, but the man underneath those performances. Calculating, rerouting, looking for the turn that put him back in the position he was used to being in. This is a woman, he said, who arrived in this town as a stranger, under arrangements that were, he chose the word carefully, irregular, who has been here 11 weeks and has the audacity to stand in front of this community and tell us how our affairs have been conducted. He let that sit. I think the people in this room deserve to ask themselves whose account they're prepared to trust. Landed the way he meant it to. Clara felt it. The slight pull in the room, the question he'd seeded taking root in the people who were already uncertain. She was going to speak again, but she didn't need to. Kellerman stood up from the fourth row. He did it with the particular awkwardness of a man who has decided to do something and knows he is going to be uncomfortable doing it and has decided to do it anyway, which is a different and more costly kind of courage than the easy sort. He was holding his hat in both hands and he looked at the floor for a moment before he looked at the room. I was at Crowell's property 3 weeks ago, Kellerman said. Voice was not loud, but the room had gone quiet enough that it didn't need to be. I heard him tell his man Asa that he was calling the note on the Hayes back 40. He said it was the right time. Said. Kellerman stopped, turned his hat, continued. He said the situation there was perfect because Hayes would be distracted. Looked up. He meant her. He meant that Hayes having a new wife in the house would be the distraction. The room was very still. I didn't say anything at the time, Kellerman said. It wasn't performing regret, it was just there, plain and uncomfortable in his voice. I'm saying something now. He sat down. Crowell's 2 city men had leaned together and were speaking in low voices. Crowell himself was standing with his expression finally. Fully recalibrated, the warmth gone, the patience gone, something harder and more honest showing through in its place. He looked at Clara with the look of a man who has realized, in the space of the last 4 minutes, that the room he walked into is not the room he planned for. This is hearsay, he said, and his voice had lost its rich, considered quality. In this he gestured at Clara, at the room, at the table with its papers and letters. This is a circus, organized by a woman who has no standing in this community and no business conducting herself as though she does. Judge Forsyth, who had been quiet and attentive through all of it, set down his pen. For Crowell, he said, in the precise, measured tone of a man who has been waiting for the appropriate moment to say something. That will be enough of that particular line. Meeting lasted another hour and a half. It was not a trial. Forsyth was careful to say so. More than once this was an airing, a documentation, record being established. But a record being established in a room full of witnesses carried its own weight. Clara understood by the time it was over that what had happened in the assembly hall that morning was not the end of anything, but a very definitive change in the shape of what was possible. Crowell left before it concluded. He stood up at some point during the testimony being given by a woman named Ruth Pfeiffer, a small, iron-spined woman in her 60s who described with flat precision what had happened to her family's eastern parcel, looking at Crowell the whole time she spoke, not looking away once, and he walked out with his 2 city men behind him, and the door closed. The room didn't exactly relax when he left, but it breathed differently. Clara sat at the table and listened to Ruth Pfeiffer, and the two other people who spoke after her. And she wrote down what they said in case Forsyth needed it. She held herself together through all of it, with the particular steadiness of someone who has been holding things together for so long they've stopped noticing the effort. Colton sat beside her through all of it, and he didn't say much. But at some point during Ruth Pfeiffer's testimony, his hand came to rest on the table close to hers, not touching. Just close, and she didn't look at it, and he didn't acknowledge it, and it stayed there until the end. Forsyth came to the ranch 4 days later. Came alone, without Mabel, which Clara took as an indication that this was official rather than social. Sat at the table, and Clara put coffee in front of him, and he opened a leather folder and set 2 documents on the table. Note on the back 40, he said, is being suspended, pending a formal review of the grounds for calling it. I've filed the documentation with the Territorial Land Office in Helena. He looked at Clara. That process will take time, but it takes Crowell's 60-day clock off the table. Clara let out a breath. The water rights transfer on the Brower parcel is also under review, Forsyth said. Based on what came out at the meeting, the Helena office has agreed to look at the pattern of transactions rather than each one individually. He paused. That was your doing, making it a pattern rather than a single case. That was Mrs. Forsyth's doing as well, Clara said. 2 letters. Without those, there's no pattern. Forsyth looked at his coffee. My wife, he said, has better judgment than I credit her for on occasion. She does, Clara said. He allowed himself a small wry expression. I imagine she'll tell me that herself. He closed the leather folder. Review will turn up what it turns up. I can't promise you what that will be. But I can tell you that Crowell operates in the space between what is legal and what is right, and the Territorial Office has been looking for a documented case to change the space between those 2 things. Colton, who had been sitting at the far end of the table, said, How long has that review been coming? Forsyth looked at him. Longer than it should have been, he said. Said it without excusing it, which Clara respected. After he left, Clara sat at the table for a while. She thought about 7 families in the 2 letters, and the hands raised in the assembly hall, and the way the room had breathed when Crowell walked out of it. She thought about Ardith Crane in her office in Billings, with ink on her finger and cold tea on her desk. She thought about Kellerman standing up with his hat in his hands, and the particular cost of that, and how it hadn't looked heroic and had been, somehow, more useful because of it. She thought about Colton's hand on the table close to hers. Eli came in from outside with Governor the Cat, following at a diplomatic distance, and he climbed onto his chair and said, With the urgency of someone reporting a significant event, Governor caught a mouse. Good for Governor, Clara said. I told him he was very brave, Eli said. Didn't say anything, but I think he was pleased. Clara looked at her son, his face lit up with the unguarded satisfaction of a child who has witnessed something impressive and been able to tell someone about it, and she felt the thing that she had been holding carefully at. Distance for the past 11 weeks settled closer. A thing that felt like, this is a life. Not the life she'd planned. Not the one she'd been handed something she'd made from what was available. In the wrong season, under the wrong circumstances, with the wrong tools. It was imperfect, and it was real, and it was hers. Eli, she said. He looked at her. Are you happy here? He thought about it, with the seriousness he brought to important questions. Yes, he said. Governor lives here. And the field. Colton, she agreed. Eli tilted his head. Are you? She looked around the kitchen, the clean stove. The maps she'd borrowed back from Forsyth rolled on the shelf. The ledger with its columns of numbers that no longer added up to disaster. The ladder to the loft she climbed every night and came down every morning. 2 chairs, and the one with the glued leg that held perfectly fine now, and the sound of the mules in the paddock outside, and the winter rye she knew was out there in the field, even though she couldn't see it from here. Yes, she said. The second thing happened 2 weeks after Forsyth's visit, and it was Colton's doing. She knew something had shifted on a Tuesday evening when she came in from checking the fencing on the southwest field's eastern edge and found him sitting at the table with a piece of paper in front of him and an expression she hadn't seen before. Not the careful blankness he used for difficult conversations. Not the focused economy of someone solving a practical problem. Something more vulnerable than either. Something he was clearly not comfortable with and was doing anyway. She hung her coat and sat down across from him. He pushed the piece of paper toward her. She looked at it. It was a letter handwritten, in Colton's careful, utilitarian script, addressed to the mail-order bride agency. She read it and she read it again, and then she set it on the table. You're telling them the arrangement worked out, she said. Yes, he said. They'll want to know if the original placement should be listed as a completed match. I know what they'll want, he said. She looked at him across the table. He was looking at the letter, not at her, and his jaw had that particular set it had when he was making himself not retreat from something. Colton, she said. He looked up. What are you asking me, she said. He was quiet for a moment. I'm not good at this, he said. Not as an apology. As a fact delivered the way he delivered most facts plainly. I know, she said. I don't. He stopped, started again. I don't know how to do the part where I say it out loud. I've been. He looked at the table surface briefly, then back at her, trying to work out how to say it for 3 weeks, and I still don't have it. She thought about what she was going to say, and then decided against the careful version and said the true one. I'm not leaving, she said. That's what you're trying to say. I'm not leaving, and I don't want to. Something in his face moved a complicated movement, relief, and something harder to name running through it at the same time. That's not all of it, he said. I know, she said. But start there. He looked at her for a long time. She held the look and didn't put anything into it that he hadn't asked for and didn't take anything back. I want you to stay, he said finally, because I want you here. Not because he stopped working for it. Not because of the field or the deal with Crane or any of the things you've done, which are there more than I. He stopped again, visibly frustrated with himself. I want you to stay, because when you came back from Billings and I saw the wagon coming and you were on it, that was the first time in 8 years. I was glad to see something coming toward me instead of just waiting for it to hit. Kitchen was very quiet. Clara looked at this man who had driven to the rail junction before dawn and held her bag and stood in the dark watching a train until it was out of sight, who had put extra blankets in the wagon without being asked, who had kept the fire while she was gone and gotten the maps from his father's time and handed them to her like they were something worth protecting, who had put his hand close to hers on a table in a room where a woman was speaking about the cost of silence and had not moved it until there was nothing more to be said. I know, she said. He looked at her. I've known for a while, she said. I was waiting for you to know it too. He exhaled, not dramatically, just the release of something held a long time. Looked at the letter on the table. I still don't know how to say. Don't have to say it today, she said. You have time. Looked up at her. You're sure? I'm not going anywhere, she said. I told you that already. The corner of his mouth moved, and this time it did become a smile, small, unpracticed, like something that hadn't been used in a long time and was still learning the shape of itself. She didn't make anything of it. She just let it be there. Weeks that followed were not simple, because nothing about their situation had ever been simple, and there was no reason to expect it to start. Territorial review moved at the pace that official things move slowly, with setbacks, with paperwork that required responses, and responses that generated more paperwork. Crowell's lawyers and Helena contested the scope of the review twice. First contest was denied. Second was partially upheld, which meant 3 additional weeks of documentation, which Clara managed with the same methodical attention she brought to everything and which Colton helped with, in the practical ways gathering records. Riding to the land office himself when the weather permitted, working with Forsyth on the water rights material that required surveying. They were not waiting. That was the important thing. They were working, steadily and with clear purpose, and the ranch was changing around the work. East Barn Wall was properly rebuilt in the second week of December. Tom Kellerman brought 2 of his men and helped, which he did without fanfare or the expectation of thanks. And Clara thanked him anyway, because she'd decided she was going to be the kind of person who said the true thing regardless of whether it was expected. Southwest Field went into its full winter preparation. And what the winter rye had done to the soil was, when Clara walked it, genuinely gratifying. The structure was improving, drainage clarifying. She adjusted her spring planting plan based on what she found and wrote Ardith Crane a detailed update that Ardith responded to within 2 weeks with precise, practical notes and 1 additional recommendation about a hybrid corn variety that had been showing strong yields in comparable Montana soil. Clara wrote back and said she'd look into it. Ardith wrote back and said good. This correspondence was one of the things Clara had not anticipated about her life in Raven Creek, that she would find unexpectedly appear. Someone who spoke the same language she did, the language of numbers and soil, and the careful architecture of long-term plans, and who had no interest in her marital status, or the circumstances of her arrival, or any of the things that had been used against her, only in whether the work was sound. She told Colton about Ardith one evening, more than she'd said before, and he listened in the way. He listened to things that mattered to him without comment, without interruption, defiling it completely. "You should go back to Billings," he said when she was done. "In the spring, when the field is in." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because she's worth knowing," he said. "And because you need," he paused, finding the right word carefully. "You need people beyond this place. Beyond me and Eli in the field." She looked at him across the table. She thought that this was what it looked like when someone paid attention to you, not to the surface of you, not to what you could do for them, but to what you actually needed, which is a rarer and more difficult thing to offer. "I'll think about it," she said. "You should go," he said. "Colton." "I'll manage 3 days," he said. And there was the shape of the smile again. Easier this time, more its own thing. The formal ruling from the Territorial Land Office arrived on a Thursday in late January, in an envelope thick with official paper. Clara read it at the table. Colton stood in the kitchen doorway. Eli was asleep in the loft. It was early morning, the light not fully up, the cold pressing at the windows. She read it through once without saying anything. Then she set it on the table. "Note on the back 40 is voided," she said. "Improper grounds, documented pattern of predatory calling, insufficient evidence of actual default risk." She looked at the second page. "Brower water rights transfer is being reversed pending a full hearing. Halverson parcel is under separate review." She turned to the third page and read it twice before she spoke. "Crowell's holding entity has been flagged for territorial audit." Kitchen was quiet. Colton came away from the doorway and sat down at the table. Looked at the papers but didn't pick them up. "Is it over?" he asked. "Audit will go the way it goes," she said. "He has lawyers and money, and he'll use them. The water rights reversal means the Brower get their creek back. The Halversons have standing now to contest." She looked at the voiding notice. "For us, the land is ours. The debt is cleared. Crane's agreement stands on its own terms, which are manageable." She looked up. "Yes," she said. "For us, it's over." He looked at the papers for a long moment. "My father's field," he said, and then stopped. She waited. "Cleared that field himself," Colton said, "before I was born. Took him 3 seasons. He looked at the table surface. He never told me it was going to go out of production when he died. Thought I'd keep it going. A pause. I didn't know how to by myself. So I let it go." Clara looked at him. She didn't say anything. "You turned it," he said. "You turned that whole field in 3 weeks." He wasn't saying it with anything attached to it, no sentiment, no performance. Just acknowledging the fact of it, the way he acknowledged most true things. "We turned it," she said. He looked at her. He said, "We did." Outside, the sun was coming up behind the mountains, and the light was starting to come through the south windows, the way it did in the mornings, slow and pale and unremarkable and entirely itself, and the field was out there under the winter sky, all 17 acres of it, holding what they'd put into it, waiting for spring. Eli's footsteps sounded on the loft floor above them. A particular loud thumping of a 4-year-old who does not see any reason to be quiet in the morning. And then the creak of the ladder. Then Eli appeared at the bottom, with his hair wild and his wooden horse in one hand, and he looked at both of them at the kitchen table, with the papers between them, and he said, "Is it a good morning?" Colton looked at Clara. "Yes," she said. Eli nodded. Satisfied, climbed into his chair and set the wooden horse on the table and began whatever private negotiation it was he conducted with it each morning. And the stove ticked, and the light moved across the floor, and outside the field waited for spring. And inside the kitchen, the 3 of them sat in the particular quiet of people who have gotten through something hard together and have not yet had to name what they are to each other. Don't need to, not yet, because they are already it. Spring came the way it always did in that part of Montana, not gently, not all at once, but in arguments. A warm week followed by 3 days of hard frost. Ground that softened enough to work and then locked up again overnight. Kind of weather that tested whether you'd prepared well or just hoped, and the difference between those two things showed clearly in which fields were ready when the real warmth finally arrived, and which ones weren't. Hayes' southwest field was ready. Clara had planned for the argument spring. It had factored the frost risk into her planting schedule the way her father had taught her. You don't plant for the weather you want. You plant for the weather that's likely. Then you build in the margin for the weather that's possible. Corn went in during the second week of April, when the soil temperature held consistently enough that she was willing to commit to it. Rye had done its work through the winter. And when she turned it under, in preparation for the corn planting, the soil had a quality she hadn't fully dared hope for, dark and open and alive in the way that good farmland is alive. The way it holds moisture without drowning. The way it breaks apart in your hands with a crumble rather than a crack. She was on her knees in the field when she noticed it. Pressing a handful of soil together and letting it fall apart, she sat back on her heels and looked at what she'd built, what the winter rye had built, what the fallow years had built without anyone intending them to, and she thought about her father's hands doing the same thing on his own land 30 years ago, testing soil the same way. Felt the particular ache that is not sadness exactly, but is close to it. The feeling of being connected to something that has already passed and that you are somehow continuing anyway. Eli was at the field's edge, not helping but present, which was his mode of involvement in most agricultural activities. He had a stick he was using to conduct some private survey of the fence line, moving along it with great seriousness, and every few minutes he would call something out to Clara, and she would answer, and he would nod and continue his survey. He had turned 5 in March. Was taller than she'd expected a 5-year-old to be. And he had developed opinions about things, about which of the cattle he liked best, about the proper way to store a saddle, about the arrangement of the kitchen shelves that he expressed with the confidence of someone who has been listened to, enough to believe his opinions are worth expressing. Colton had done that. She knew it, even though neither of them had discussed it, because it was the kind of thing you didn't need to discuss once you'd seen it happening. He had listened to Eli with the same patient attention he brought to every practical problem, not performing interest, just actually interested, because Eli was actually interesting if you paid attention. Colton paid attention to things the way most people didn't bother to. She watched her son moving along the fence with his stick, and she thought, he is going to be all right. Not because the circumstances were easy, they weren't, and they wouldn't be, but because the thing he was growing up inside of was real, and the people in it were real. And that was more than she'd had at his age, and more than she'd managed to build in the years between his birth and this field. She stood up and brushed the soil from her knees and went back to work. Colton had been different since January. Not dramatically different. He was not a man given to dramatic change, and she would have been suspicious of it if he were. But there was a quality of presence in him now that hadn't been there before, or hadn't been visible before, which amounted to the same thing in practice. He looked at her differently. Not with more warmth. Exactly, the warmth had been there for a while. Quiet and consistent, easy to miss if you weren't paying attention, but with less guard. Like he'd stopped bracing for something. She noticed it in small things. Started talking more at dinner, not much more. Because he was still Colton, still fundamentally a man of economy. But more than before. He told her things about the land that she hadn't asked about, the history of it, the specific personality of each section. He told her about the northern pasture that flooded every spring in his father's time and had been redirected by a drainage ditch that was slowly filling in and would need to be cleared. He told her about the stand of cottonwoods at the property's western edge that his mother had insisted on keeping when everyone else thought they were a nuisance, and how his father had complained about them every year and had never cut a single one. Clara listened to all of it. She understood that these stories were the language available to him, that what he was doing in telling her these things was the equivalent of what other men might have done with different words entirely, and that she should receive them accordingly. She did. One evening in late February, after Eli was asleep, and the fire had burned down to the comfortable glow that meant it would hold through the night without tending, Colton set something on the table between them. Small object, wrapped in a piece of clean cloth. She looked at it, then at him. "Open it," he said. She unwrapped it. It was a ring, plain silver. No ornamentation. Not new. Size small enough that she understood it had been made for a woman with fine hands. She looked at it for a moment without speaking. "It was my mother's," he said. "Not her wedding ring. She had a ring my father gave her the year after they married, when the first harvest came in, and he could afford to give her something he actually chose instead of something he could afford." Clara looked at the ring and the cloth on the table. "I had it sized," he said, "by the jeweler in Billings when I went for the feed account in January." He stopped. "I wasn't sure when to give it to you. I've been carrying it around for 8 weeks. She looked up at him. He was looking at the ring, not at her. With the expression he wore when he was doing something that required more vulnerability than he was comfortable with, which was his honest face, the one she'd come to trust more than any of the others. "Colton," she said. He looked up. "Is this you asking me?" she said. Yes, he said, it is. She picked up the ring from the cloth. It was well made, the silver worn smooth in the way of things that have been worn and loved. She held it for a moment and thought about the woman who had worn it before her, who had stood in this same land and made a life in it. She thought about what it meant to be handed something that had already held meaning and be trusted to add your own to it. Yes, she said. He looked at her. Something in his face moved that complicated movement she'd seen before, but fuller this time. Less guarded. It allowed more space than she'd seen him allow anything. Sure, he said, and it wasn't quite a question. Colton, she said, I've been sure since I decided not to get back on the train. Hailed. She slid the ring onto her finger, and it fit because he'd had it sized by the Billings jeweler after measuring the ring she wore on her right hand while she was sleeping, which she didn't find out about until she asked him later. Again, which made her laugh genuinely, fully, kind of laugh that catches you off guard because it was such a precisely Colton way to have done it. Practical and careful and entirely without announcement. They married in April, 3 weeks before the corn went in. It was a small thing Forsyth presided, because he was both justice of the peace and the person most responsible for the legal ground they were standing on. And he did it without ceremony in the front room of the ranch house, with Eli standing beside Clara in his good shirt, holding the wooden horse, because he had refused to leave it behind, and no one had argued strongly enough to change his mind. Mabel Forsyth came, and Nora Harding, and Tom Kellerman, who stood near the back with his hat in his hands, and the expression of a man who has been forgiven for something and is still learning to carry that. Gareth Crane sent a letter. It arrived 2 days before the wedding. Clara read it at the kitchen table and didn't share its contents. Colton saw her face when she set it down, and he didn't ask, because her face said what needed to be said clearly enough. It was not a romantic occasion, exactly. Clara had never particularly wanted a romantic occasion. She had wanted a real one, and this was real in every part of it. Colton said the words with the same careful directness he brought to everything, and she said them back the same way. And when it was done, Eli said, "Is that it?" John Forsythe said yes, that was it. And Eli said good and went out to check on Governor. Nora Harding had brought a cake, which was more than anyone had asked for and exactly what was needed. They ate it at the kitchen table. All 7 of them crowded around the space designed for 2. And the conversation was imperfect and overlapping, and Clara got frosting on her sleeve, and Colton told the story of the drainage ditch at the north pasture to Kellerman in a way that made Kellerman actually laugh. And it was not the wedding she would have described if someone had asked her at 20 what she imagined. Gee, it was better than that. It was the kind of thing you only get by living through the parts that were not good and arriving on the other side with the people who helped you get there. Corn was 18 inches tall by June. Clara walked the rows every morning, checking the spacing, color of the leaves, moisture at the soil surface. She had learned to read the field the way she'd learned to read most important things slowly, by paying attention day after day until the patterns became legible. She knew which rows were strongest and which needed another amendment at the base. She knew that the northeast corner drained faster than the rest and needed more frequent checking after dry stretches. Nora Harding came out to look at it in mid-June, and she stood at the field's edge and looked out at the corn in the summer light and was quiet for a long moment. My husband would like to discuss the grain supply arrangement, she said. Formally, in writing, I know, Clara said. Tell him to come when he's ready. Nora looked at her with a kind of expression that Clara had started to see on people in Raven Creek. An expression she didn't entirely know how to receive, something between respect and the particular discomfort of people who have had to revise their understanding of someone significantly and are still completing the revision. He was wrong about you, Nora said. Not about the arrangement, not about the circumstances. About Clara herself. He didn't know me, Clara said. No, Nora said. But he made the assumption anyway. We all did. Clara looked at the corn. Most people do, she said. About most things. The question is what you do when you find out you were wrong. Nora was quiet for a moment. My mother used to say that an honest mistake is just ignorance with a short shelf life. The ones that don't update that are the problem. Clara looked at her. I like your mother. She died when I was 14, Nora said. She would have liked you too. She turned back toward the field. That's 18 acres of corn, Clara. 18 and a quarter, Clara said. Nora almost smiled. We'll send Marcus on Thursday. Marcus Harding came on Thursday with a signed letter of intent and a handshake, and the slightly bewildered expression of a man who is committed to something he'd been resistant to and discovered the resistance was the thing that didn't make sense. Kellerman agreement followed 2 weeks later. Between the two of them, the first harvest was spoken for at prices that covered Ardith Crane's first repayment, rebuilt the full barn wall reserve, and left enough margin that Colton looked at Clara's figures one evening and said, after a long silence, "This is better than I thought it could be." The soil was always there, she said. It just needed someone to work it. He looked at her. "I don't mean the field," he said. She held his gaze and didn't look away. "I know," she said. Territorial audit of Crowell's holding entity concluded in August. D. The findings were not made public in their entirety, but enough came through official channels that Forsyth could explain them to Clara and Colton in his careful, measured way over the course of an hour at the ranch one afternoon. The audit had found irregularities in 7 separate property transactions over 6 years. Water rights transfer on the Brower parcel was reversed permanently. 2 other transactions were ordered unwound, returning parcels to the families who had lost them. Remaining 4 were subject to financial penalties that, by Forsyth's accounting, were substantial enough to matter even to a man of Crowell's means. Crowell himself was not imprisoned. Clara had known, when she started this, that imprisonment was unlikely. He had lawyers, and the lawyers had kept everything in the space between wrong and illegal that men like Crowell knew how to inhabit. But the audit had closed some of that space permanently, and the public record now named what he had been doing. And in a territory where your reputation was a working asset, that naming had consequences. He sold his Raven Creek property in September. To whom and for how much was not something Clara was told officially, though the informal version reached her through Mabel Forsyth within 2 weeks, because Mabel had developed a habit of keeping Clara informed of things she thought Clara should know, which Clara accepted in the spirit it was offered. She did not feel triumphant when she heard it. She had thought she might, and she didn't. What she felt was something quieter and less satisfying, in the immediate sense a kind of settled acknowledgement, like watching a storm finally move off the horizon. It had been there. Now it wasn't. The damage it had done was still there, and the work of repairing it was still in front of the people it had damaged. The storm itself was gone. Ruth Pfeiffer came to the ranch 2 days after Crowell's sale was confirmed. She came with a jar of preserved plums, which she set on the table without explanation. She sat down and drank the coffee Clara put in front of her and looked at the kitchen with the eyes of a woman who has been in enough frontier kitchens to read them accurately. "Made something here," Ruth said. "We have," Clara said. Ruth looked at her. She was in her 60s, Ruth Pfeiffer, and she had the face of someone who had survived a great deal and had stopped pretending that survival was without cost. "I've been in this territory 30 years, she said, "and I've watched men like Crowell take what they wanted for 30 years. I've watched people like me let it happen because we didn't know we weren't alone in it." She turned her coffee cup in her hands, made that visible, the meeting, the documentation, making it a pattern instead of a series of individual misfortunes. She paused. "Should have done that 30 years ago. I had the information." Clara looked at her steadily. "You didn't have anyone to bring it to," she said. "Maybe," Ruth said. "Or maybe I was afraid. There's a version of it that's just afraid." She looked at the preserved plums on the table. "Either way, thank you." Clara didn't deflect it. She had learned by now to let gratitude be received rather than redirected, because redirecting it was a way of refusing the connection it was trying to make. "You stood up in that room," she said. "That wasn't nothing." "Wasn't enough," Ruth said. "Not for years." "It was enough for that day," Clara said. That day changed the next one. Ruth looked at her for a long moment, and then she did something Clara didn't expect. She laughed. Not with humor exactly, but with the recognition of someone who has just heard a true thing stated plainly, the laugh that is also a kind of release. "Stubborn," Ruth said. "Very," Clara agreed. Harvest came in early September, and it was good. Not spectacular. Clara had not promised spectacular. She had in fact built her projections conservatively, because she'd learned that the difference between a plan that works and one that doesn't is often whether the person making it has been honest about what could go wrong. But it was good. It was solidly, demonstrably good. And it came in on time, and under the prices she'd projected to the Harding and Kellerman operations. And when the last wagon left the field, Colt stood at the edge of the harvested rows in the early evening light and looked at the stubble and the turned earth and the mountains behind it all, and didn't say anything for a long time. Eli was beside him. He'd been at the field all day. running between the wagons with the particular useless helpfulness of a 5-year-old who believes he is essential to every operation and whom everyone therefore finds a way to make essential, because it costs nothing and because watching him carry 1 ear of corn at a time to the wagon with the seriousness of a man moving gold was, as Kellerman's hired man had put it, the best part of the day. Eli looked up at Colton. "Did we do good?" he asked. Colton looked down at him. "Yeah," he said, "we did good." Eli nodded with satisfaction. He had dirt on his face and a corn silk in his hair and the wooden horse in his left hand, because the wooden horse went everywhere, and he looked at the harvested field, and then at the mountains, and then back at Colton. "Is this ours?" he asked. Colton looked at Clara, who was standing a few feet away with the field ledger in her arm, and she held his look for a moment and let him answer. "Yes," Colton said. He looked back at the field. "This is ours." Eli accepted this. "Good," he said. Got and went to look for Governor, who had stationed himself at the field edge for reasons of his own that he was keeping private. Clara stood in the late light and watched Colton watch the field, and she thought about the train from Billings, the dust on the platform, sound of men laughing and the weight of Eli's hand in hers, and the $11 in her coat pocket, and the letter with its worn fold lines. She thought about the specific quality of Colton's voice when he said she deserves a home not loudly, not heroically, just as a fact he'd decided was true and was naming out loud. Thought about what it had cost him to say that in front of people who were laughing, about what it had cost her to follow him to the wagon and what it had meant, over the months since, discover that the thing she'd followed was actually there, not the thing she'd hoped was there, not a version of it, but the actual thing, perfect and real and completely reliable in the ways that mattered. She thought about what kind of story this was. It was not the story anyone had intended to tell, not Crowell, who had planned a humiliation, not the men on the platform who had planned a joke, not even, entirely, Clara herself, who had arrived with a plan of her own survive, build, endure that had been correct in its general direction and completely wrong about what she was building toward. She thought that most important things were like that. You aimed for survival and ended up with something you couldn't have planned, because the planning only got you to the place where the real thing could happen, and the real thing was never the plan. She thought about the people she'd watched underestimate her. She thought about all the ways she had let them, and all the ways she hadn't. She thought that the difference between those two things was not always a moral distinction. Sometimes you let it happen, because fighting every instance of it was more energy than you had, and you had to choose your ground. Choosing of ground was the skill, knowing which hill was worth the fight. She thought about Eli, who would grow up knowing his mother had chosen her ground and held it. She thought about what that would teach him, not the lesson version of it, not the one you could write out as instruction, but the thing he would carry in his body from having watched it, knowledge that stayed in the hands and the spine rather than the head. She thought about Colton, who had picked up her carpet bag on a train platform in front of people who were laughing at both of them and had not explained himself or justified it or looked for anyone's approval, just turned and walked to his wagon. She had not understood at the time that she was watching someone who was also choosing his ground. She understood it now. She thought about the women who had made this possible in ways she hadn't anticipated. Ardith Crane with her cold tea and her unreasonable standards. Mabel Forsyth, who had come to the ranch and sat down and said, "I owe you an apology," with the difficulty of someone who means it. Nora Harding, who had signed without the theater of deliberation. Ruth Pfeiffer, who had stood up in the assembly hall and looked at Crowell the whole time she spoke. None of them had been waiting for someone to organize them. They had been waiting for the moment that made it possible to be organized. Clara had provided the moment, which was not the same as providing the courage had been theirs. And it had been there all along. And that was the thing about people that Clara thought was most true and most consistently underestimated, that the capacity was usually there before the conditions arrived to call it out. And the conditions were more often than not made by someone who decided to go first. She had gone first, and the people who had followed her had made the thing real. In October, Clara went back to Billings. Colton had reminded her of it in September, as he had said he would. She had pushed back gently, because the harvest was in, and there was so much to do before winter, and he had looked at her with the patient expression he reserved for moments when she was arguing against her own interests. "The harvest is in," he said. "The accounts are settled. It's 3 weeks before the real work starts again." He looked at her steadily. Go she went, She spent 4 days in Billings, 2 of them with Ardith Crane. Ray went over the second year's lending terms and the modified repayment structure that the first harvest made possible. When they talked about the expansion, Clara had been thinking about a third field on the northwest section, which would require drainage work first, but which had potential she'd been watching all summer. Ardith had questions that were penetrating and that required Clara to have thought through the answers which she had. On the third day, they didn't talk about business at all. They had dinner at a place Ardith knew, a small restaurant with good food and no pretension, and they talked about things that had nothing directly to do with soil composition or lending terms. Ardith talked about the woman who had turned down her first loan application for her own business 25 years ago because she believed women in finance were a credit risk by definition, and what she had done with that, not the anger of it, which had been real and sharp, but the use she'd made of it, the specific redirection of it, into something that had outlasted the woman who inspired it. Clara talked about Eli and about Colton, not the story of them, but the present tense reality of them. The way Eli said in Colton now, as naturally as he said in Mama, the way Colton had taken to leaving the field reports on the table in the morning with notes in his handwriting about things he'd noticed, as though he'd been doing it for years. Ardith listened, with the full attention she brought to everything. "You didn't expect this," she said. "Not of the ranch or the field," Clara had described. "No," Clara said. "I expected to survive." And instead, Clara thought about how to say it accurately. "Instead, I found out that I'd been planning in too small a space," she said. "I'd been making plans sized for what I thought I was worth." Ardith looked at her for a moment. "And now? Now I make bigger plans," Clara said. Ardith's expression moved towards something that was not quite a smile, but was warmer than her usual precision. "Good," she said, "because I have a proposal regarding the Northwest Drainage Project that requires considerably larger plans." Clara looked at her across the dinner table in the small Billings restaurant and felt, again, the thing she'd felt the first time she sat across from this woman. Particular relief of being met at the level you actually operate at, by someone who expects as much of you as you expect of yourself and doesn't apologize for it. "Tell me," Clara said. She came home to Raven Creek on a Thursday, which was becoming a pattern. Wagon was at the rail junction, same as always. This time, Colton wasn't alone. Eli was beside him on the seat, sitting with the exaggerated upright posture of a 5-year-old who has been told he can come along if he sits still and is taking the condition very seriously. Wooden horse was on his lap. Governor, against all reasonable expectation, had apparently followed the wagon to the junction and was sitting in the wagon bed with the dignified indifference of a cat who was absolutely not there for the company. Clara laughed when she saw them, all 3 of them, the man and the boy and the cat, waiting at the junction in the October light. She walked to the wagon, and Eli launched himself off the seat, and she caught him, and he said, into her neck, "We brought Governor." "I see that," she said. "He wanted to come," Eli said. "Or he followed us." "We're not sure. Governor keeps his own counsel," Clara said. "That's what Colton said," Eli said. She set him down, and he went to retrieve the wooden horse, which had fallen in the excitement, and she looked at Colton. He was standing by the wagon with her bag already in his hand, and an expression that she had learned to read as the one he wore when something had shifted in him and he hadn't found the words for it yet. "Good trip?" he asked. "Very," she said. "Ardith has a proposal about the northwest section." "I figured she would," he said. "You can tell me on the way." She climbed up to the seat, and he handed her bag up and went around to his side, and Eli climbed back up between them, because that was where he sat now, between them on the wagon seat, perfectly centered, as though he'd always been there, and the space had always been his, and Colton clicked at the horses, and they turned toward home. She told him about Ardith's proposal on the way. He asked the questions he always asked, practical ones, specific ones, questions of someone who has done enough real work to know which details matter, and Eli fell asleep against Clara's side. Before they were halfway home, the wooden horse still in his hand, his head heavy on her arm. The mountains were lit along their western faces in the low afternoon light, and the fields on either side of the road were brown and quiet in the way of things that have given what they had and are resting now before they give again. Gaza, and the road was familiar under the wheels in the particular way that roads become familiar when you've traveled them enough that your body knows the bumps before they come. She thought about all the roads she'd traveled before this one. She thought about Dobson and the house she'd lost and the name she'd kept and the son she'd gained and the years between then and the train platform in Raven Creek. She thought about all the ways a person could arrive somewhere with a plan, without one. carried by circumstances they didn't choose, and how arrival was never the end of anything, just the beginning of the next part of it. She thought about what she would tell Eli when he was old enough to ask about it. Not the story, exactly he would know the story. He was already part of it, and would grow up knowing the pieces of it that were his to know. But the thing underneath it, the thing that the story was trying to say. She thought she would tell him this: that the world has a habit of deciding what you're worth before you've had a chance to demonstrate it. And that habit is wrong more often than it's right. That doesn't mean it stops trying. The response to being underestimated is not to convince the people doing it. You don't have enough time or energy for that, and it's the wrong target anyway. Response is to work, to build the thing that makes the argument better than you ever could. D. To find the people who will stand up when you need them and be ready to stand up for them when they need it. Choose your ground and hold it. Thought she would tell him that the most important thing, the thing she had learned, not from books or instruction, but from the specific experience of arriving somewhere with nothing and building something out of what was. There was that home is not a place you're given, a place you make. You make it with your hands and your decisions and your willingness to stay when staying is hard. And when you've made it, it belongs to you in a way that nothing simply given could. Ranch came into view around the last curve, the barn with its rebuilt east wall, the house with its light already on inside, because Colton had fixed the lamp timer in November. Southwest field stubble brown and spent, and full of what it would be in spring. The northwest section visible beyond the tree line where the drainage work was going to begin in March. Eli stirred against her side but didn't wake, and his hand tightened slightly around the wooden horse, the reflex grip of a sleeping child holding on to what matters to him. Colton pulled the horses to a stop at the yard and sat for a moment without getting down, looking at the house. "Ardith's proposal," he said. "Do you want to do it?" She looked at the house, the field, the mountains behind all of it. Nah. She thought about Ardith Crane's face across the dinner table and the quality of the conversation they had, and the third field on the northwest section, and the larger plans she'd decided she was allowed to make. "Yes," she said. He nodded. He looked at Eli, asleep between them, and something crossed his face, quiet and unguarded and entirely itself. "Going to want to help," Colton said. "He's going to carry one shovelful at a time, and believe he's doing half the work," Clara said. "He will be," Colton said, roughly. She looked at him, and he was almost smiling. She was. Gone the horses were patient at the rail, and the lamp was lit in the kitchen window, and the land stretched out in every direction around them. Ordinary and specific and entirely theirs. There are things you can plan for, and things you can't. You can plan for drought and frost and soft markets and men who want what you have and will use whatever's available to take it. You can plan for the hard seasons and build margin into your projections and make your agreements in writing and keep the receipts. These things help. They are not nothing. What you cannot plan for is the person who picks up your bag without being asked. Woman in Billings with ink on her finger who looks at your numbers and sees not a risk, but a person worth backing. Neighbor who stands up with his hat in his hands because his wife told him it was right and he decided she was correct. Child who carries the wooden horse everywhere. Who names the cattle? Who sits between two people on a wagon seat as though he has always belonged there? Which he has. Cannot plan for the moment you realize that the thing you built to survive in became the thing you cannot imagine surviving without. The place you came to with nothing is now the place that holds everything. Clara had arrived in Raven Creek as a joke. She knew that. She had always known it. And she had never once, in all the months since, tried to pretend otherwise. Because pretending otherwise would have meant pretending she hadn't known what she was walking into. And she had known. She had walked in anyway, and that walking in was the truest thing about her, truer than the widowhood, or the $11, or the worn letter, or any of the circumstances that had preceded her arrival. She had walked in. And she had stayed. And she had worked. And she had built. The town that had laughed at her arrival was now supplied by her field. Families that Crowell had moved against were beginning, slowly, to recover the ground they'd lost. Ardith Crane's lending terms had been cited by 2 other operations in the territory as a model worth following. Kellerman's hired man still talked about Eli carrying corn. The land office in Helena had filed the Raven Creek case as a precedent. Forsyth had told her that without particular ceremony, the way he told her most things, she had received it the same way as a fact, not a triumph. Triumphs felt too final for something that was still moving, still growing, still asking more of the people inside it. She got down from the wagon and lifted Eli without waking him and carried him inside, his weight familiar and warm, his hand still around the wooden horse. She laid him in his own bed now, in the room off the kitchen that Colton had built out for him in February, measuring the space 3 times before he started cutting lumber, which was Colton's version of caring, and she pulled the blanket over him and looked at his sleeping face for a moment. She went back out to help Colton with the horses. The night was cold and clear and the stars were fully out, the sky enormous and closed the way it was only in that part of the world, and they worked in the familiar quiet of 2 people who have shared enough labor to need no instruction and require no conversation. When the horses were settled and the barn was closed, Colton put his hand at the small of her back as they walked to the house, and she leaned into it for a moment, just a moment, and they went inside to where the lamp was burning. Fire needed building up, and she built it. The kettle needed filling, and he filled it. Kitchen settled into its nighttime sounds, the tick of the cooling stove, wind at the north window, the far-off sound of the cattle in the barn, the smaller sound of a sleeping child in the next room, and they sat at the table with their tea and the draft of Ardith's proposal between them. And they talked about the northwest section, and the drainage work, and what the spring would need, and what they were going to build next. Outside, the land held what they had put into it and waited, as land does, for what they would put into it next.